by MINUSMA to the G5 Sahel Joint Force. But this alone is not enough. I urge you again to provide African peace enforcing and counter-terrorist operations with clear mandates, backed by predictable and sustainable financial support through assessed contributions. Mr. President, sustainable, inclusive development is an end in itself. It is also the most effective way to address the underlying causes of conflict, extremism and terrorism. Tackling poverty and building resilient, tackling poverty and inequality, strengthening state institutions and civil society, and promoting human rights are essential to preventing conflict and building resilient communities and societies. These goals are central to both the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the African Union's Agenda 2063. We are working in full alignment with the AU through our joint framework on sustainable development for a peaceful and prosperous Africa, with a strong focus on inclusivity, women's rights and gender equality. Women's meaningful participation and leadership will strengthen our responses and are essential to lasting peace. Addressing the climate crisis is another vital preventive measure. Climate-related risks, including droughts, floods, and changing rainfall patterns, often intersect with political, social, and economic factors. We must urgently reduce emissions to prevent catastrophic consequences for sustainable development and security across Africa, and step up support for the countries most affected. Today, it is indisputable that climate change has aggravated security challenges, particularly in the Sahel. Nearly half of Africa's population of 1.3 billion are under the age of 15. Education, training, and job opportunities for this generation must be central to any development strategy. As we saw most recently in Sudan, women and young people are key builders of peaceful societies. I urge you to work with them and for them far more effectively.
Mr. President, when prevention fails, the United Nations work with our partners to reduce suffering, resolve conflicts, and build sustainable peace. We strongly support the African Union's Silence the Guns 2020 initiative as a basis for advancing peace and security and offering a safer and better future. I commend the Security Council for its resolution on this initiative and for emphasizing the role of young people. Our enhanced strategic partnership with the African Union on peace and security is based on the Joint Framework Agreement of 2017. It was demonstrated again in February when this Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2457 on steps towards ending conflict in Africa through enhanced international cooperation and partnership. Our largest peacekeeping missions are on the African continent, and more than 80,000 peacekeepers serve there. And Africa is now the largest troop-contributing region. We owe these Blue Helmets our strong and united support through robust funding and strong mandates. I commend the Council's cooperation with the African Union, including with the AU's Peace and Security Council. Across the continent, the United Nations is working in steadfast and close cooperation with the African Union and African sub-regional organizations to prevent and resolve conflicts. The Central African Republic is just one example. The United Nations, the African Union and others are cooperating in support of the historic agreement reached in February to end violence against civilians, strengthen the extension of state authority, and bring social development to this conflict-ravaged country. Mr. President, conflict prevention is difficult to quantify and may not make news. But no news is good news for the people we serve. Prevention brings enormous rewards. Conflict prevention and resolution depend on the engagement of the parties involved. Beyond that, they require a united international position and a commitment to shared goals. The Council's strong engagement in prevention of efforts on the African continent, in collaboration with regional and sub-regional partners, is needed and appreciated more than ever. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Liberata Mulla. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, members of the Council, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. At the outset, allow me to express to you, Mr. President, to express my gratitude to you, Mr. President, for organizing this extremely important debate on the centrality of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention and resolution in addressing the agenda for peace and security in Africa. I'm so honored and humbled to be among the invited briefers and been given this opportunity, the first opportunity, to share with the Council my experience and our call with regard to the role of women in peace building and conflict resolution. Mr. President, before I do that, I wish to congratulate you on presiding over the work of the Council this month of October, which is an important month in the history of the United Nations. The world is widely witnessing the erosion of multilateralism and its contribution to make the world a better place for all of us to live. The fact that the Council is debating on the primacy of preventive diplomacy is a stark reminder that we have not lived to the raison d'etre of the United Nations, in which we, the people of the United Nations, declared our determination to save the succeeding generation from the scourge of war. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, as you deliberate on the important steps required to strengthen preventive diplomacy, allow me to flag some of the issues arising from my own experience in the various peace processes, as well as the women platforms which have been privileged to participate. I come from Tanzania, a country that has played an extraordinary role in conflict resolution, preventive diplomacy, peace building in the Great Lakes region and beyond. Therefore, I wish to state here that my career path has exposed me to conflict resolution, managing conflict, and seeking negotiated solution. I was privileged, Mr. President, to serve as the first executive secretary of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. The evolution of this organization is traced from the Rwanda genocide and the wars that embroidered the Great Lakes region between 1994 to 2004. This regional framework constitutes the regional responses to the violent conflicts and genocide that plagued the region. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, every peace initiatives, every interventions, mediations processes, concepts, frameworks, legal instruments, you name it, have been tried in the Great Lakes region. The signing of the Pact on Peace, Stability and Development in the Great Lakes region that established the International Conference on the Great Lakes region was seen as a milestone that demonstrated the strong political will of states in the region to build the structures and expand the scope of responsibility to prevention beyond governments. This brought on board the civil society, the women and youth groups. The follow-up mechanisms that were established, which include a summit of the heads of state, the Regional Ministerial Council, the Secretariat, and the national coordination mechanisms, were to ensure that appropriate measures are established to prevent conflicts escalating to violence and mass atrocity levels. Mr. President, the complexity of the issues involved and the cyclic violence meant that any meaningful attempt to address the issues of peace and security in the region and the African continent must be premised on a regional framework and regional approach. As countries in the region have a better understanding of the situation on the ground than maybe external actors. Though with time, the assessment of legitimacy and the role of the countries in the region having common interests has been put to question, and the scholars have written so much about this. Let me emphasize that despite the few political instabilities remaining and the many unresolved issues, at least the guns are silent in that part of the region for now. Had the enormous responsibility to sustainably transform legacies and cycles of violent conflicts and genocide to peaceful coexistence between communities and countries of the region. It was not an easy task, but as the saying goes, if you want to get something done, give it to a woman. And if you want it well said, give it to a man. I was to facilitate dialogue to prevent, contain, and manage situations that are likely to affect peace and security, and seek to identify potential triggers of intrastate and interstate hostilities. Mr. President, in reading one of the reports of the UN Conflict Prevention and Preventive in Action, I get the nostalgia that the use of the Secretary General's good offices by deploying special envoys and representatives in conflict areas are more directed in the attempt to prevent conflicts or crises from escalating rather than preventing them before they occur. There are reported successes in Mali, Burkina Faso, Colombia, and others, but it's always sometimes too little, too late. I recall at the peak of the political crisis in Burundi, the peace-building commission configuration for Burundi was supposed to undertake a mission to Burundi, and we on the ground were eagerly waiting for the reinforcement from the peace-building commission. But at the last minute, the mission was canceled because of what was said as the security situation in the country, while the leaders from the region were flowing in Burundi. So, Mr. President, allow me, because I assume, seeing the briefers around the table, that this debate will be centered, among others, on the women, peace, and security agenda. At the 205 World Summit, the world leaders reaffirmed the important role of women in conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building. They called for the full and effective implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women and peace and security. And for the first time, they accepted the linkages across development, peace, and security and human rights. In addition, and further to the obligations under the UN Security Council Resolution above, the United Nations and the Great Lakes region, which I know most, adopted a framework for peace, security, and cooperation for the DRC and the region in February 2013, as well as the Women Platform. The Women Platform in that volatile region, which I'm its integral part, provides a framework for promoting the important role of women in peace and political processes in the region, as well as contribute to the much desired stability by participating in creating the requisite conditions for peace and development in the region, among others. The remarkable thing worth reporting here, Mr. President, is that though the platform was initiated and launched by Her Excellency Madam Mary Robinson, the then UN Secretary General Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region, our successors, who are both men, Ambassador Dijinit, and the current Special Envoy, Ambassador Shea, have made this their flagship program for the preventive diplomacy and peace building in the region with tremendous success. The joint UN peace missions we have conducted in Burundi, Central African Republic, DRC, and Sudan would not have been possible without their full support in terms of resources and political will. I wish to salute them for being the outstanding model of the E for She campaign in words and deeds. Mr. President, despite all these instruments and national action plans and mechanisms for implementation, equal representation and demonstrated influence of women on policies related to peace and security are not yet achieved. Violence against women remains the most, perhaps, the most pervasive human rights violation in the African continent and in the region in particular. The absence of and lack of African women participation in formal mediation processes at the peace table in particular is an important area of the UN Security Council 1325 agenda that remains poorly implemented. In addition, women's significant contribution to a strong role in subnational and local mediation and conflict prevention initiatives continue to be largely unrecognized and weakly supported. It is against this backdrop, Mr. President, that the African Union took landmark decisions leading to the establishment of the network of African women in conflict prevention and mediation, officially referred to as FEMWISE Africa. The modalities of its operations were endorsed by the AU Peace and Security Council on 13 March 2017 and got additional endorsement by this August body on 27 March 2017 as part of an AREA formula meeting. Mr. President, with your indulgence, allow me to explain a bit more about FEMWISE Africa, which I find of direct relevance to the objectives of this debate on preventive diplomacy and the peace and security in Africa. FEMWISE, as its name suggests, aims to strengthen the role of women in conflict prevention and mediation efforts in the context of the African peace and security architecture. The network provides a platform for strategic advocacy, capacity building, and networking aimed at enhancing the implementation of the commitments for women's inclusion in peacemaking in Africa. Among its priorities is professionalizing the role of women in preventive diplomacy and mediation at tracks 1, 2, and 3 levels, and ensuring a channel for women's meaningful and effective participation in peace processes. In all, Mr. President, FEMWISE aims at bridging the gap between track 1, 2, and 3 mediation and synergizing efforts towards inclusive peace processes with sustainable outcomes. We were in Burundi in the month of June this year on a joint peace mission of the FEMWISE Africa and the UN Office of the Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region. Under the leadership, this mission was under the leadership of Her Excellency Mama Catherine Samba Panza, the interim president of Central African Republic, and Her Excellency Mama Spenciosa Kazibwe, the former vice president of Uganda, now a member of the panel of the wise of the African Union. The objective of this mission, Mr. President, was to engage the authorities in Burundi and Central African Republic and DRC to involve the women, the civil society, and other stakeholders for dialogue. And in Burundi specifically, as they head towards the general elections hopefully next year, we thought this was timely to be able to engage all stakeholders in this preventive diplomacy. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, what struck us most, among others, is how the Burundi have been receptive to FEMWISE and localized to their situations. With the support of the Gender Ministry, they have formed mediation teams at the community level, drawing inspiration from FEMWISE to mitigate conflicts and tension among communities before they escalate to crisis level. This is one of the good practices of preventive diplomacy at the local and grassroots level, which needs to be upscaled and supported if we have to achieve sustained peace and development in that country. The AU has involved women in its initiative of silencing the guns by 2020. We met in Constantine, Algeria, to see how best we can play our role in ensuring that the African Union meets these aspirations. We'll be celebrating next year the anniversaries of the landmark aspirations, including 20 years of the UN Security Council 1325, 25 years of Beijing Platform of Action, which is the mother of the 30% gender quotas of for women representation, and of course, silencing the guns in Africa by 2020. The question, Mr. President, is will the guns be silent in Africa come 2020? The African Women Leaders Network, which was launched in June 2017 here at the United Nations headquarters, jointly by the African Union Commission and the United Nations in partnership with the Federal Republic of Germany, aims to bolster the leadership of women in governance, peace and security for Africa's transformation, including participating actively in seeing that women play a meaningful role in silencing the guns through our advocacy and sensitization of communities. As a coordinator of the peace and security pillar of the network, I call on the Council to recognize these efforts and support the network with the necessary resources to make a difference. I'm proud to report that the network, under the able leadership of Mama Amina Mohamed, the UN Deputy Secretary General, Mama Pumzile Mlambo Nguka, UN Women Executive Director, and Mama Bineta Diop, the AU Special Envoy on Peace and Security, has set the goal of generating sustainable and concrete actions for women in Africa, in line with the African Union and the United Nations commitments to prevention and delivering tangible solutions on the ground. Mr. President, women do not need to prove their substantive impact to find solutions to the drivers of armed conflict and displacement, but to reinforce their proactive role played by the women in peace building and sustainable development. I'm encouraged by the UN Secretary General's initiative for making prevention the overarching priority for achieving peace and development. Your meeting here, Mr. President, is a clear testimony of the commitment of states and the Council to take deliberate measures to prevent conflicts, mass atrocity in Africa and worldwide. My humble appeal to the Council is to put money where our mouth is, namely to invest in conflict prevention and efforts that target the root causes and drivers of violence. It is high time, Mr. President, to see women not as victims, but agents of preventive diplomacy and playing a catalytic role to peace building. I'm again privileged to be a member of the Secretary General's Advisory Group on Peace Building, where the programs of women empowerment and youth have been accorded priority. Though, Mr. Secretary General, we are still seen wanting in engaging effectively and meaningful local women organizations due to hamstrung financial regulations and criteria that govern your fund. They need to be changed in line with your commitment to seeing the women play a meaningful role in preventive diplomacy, conflict resolution, peace building, sustainable development. Mr. President, finally, drawing from the aforementioned, let me just conclude with few recommendations. First and foremost, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General's Excellencies, there is no need, as you deliberate on this preventive diplomacy, there is no need to reinvent the wheel, as the mechanisms, frameworks, legal instruments exist, including the regional mechanisms, the national action plans drawn under the UN Security Council 1325 for women that remain unimplemented due to lack of resources and of course, maybe the political will for implementation. Secondly, a regional or sub-regional approach, need to emphasize, should be the primary and most appropriate response mechanism for preventing diplomacy in Africa. Thirdly, we see that the annual cost of more than 1 billion for maintaining the peacekeeping force, for example, in DRC. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, this money would go a long way in implementing, for example, the national action plans that would translate commitments on women, peace and security into national policies and programs of many African countries. Thirdly, Mr. President, I call on the Council to support and enhance capacity of African regional organizations and women engaged in conflict prevention and mediation through the FEMWISE and the other women platforms. The focus should be on proactive conflict prevention before conflict escalates, more than reactive conflict prevention, preventing conflict that have already occurred. The various initiatives taken at the international and regional level will have no effect if they work in isolation from the local initiatives and ensuring local ownership for sustainability. The regional blocs, as mentioned in your statement, Mr. Secretary General, have assumed a vital role in conflict resolution through mediation efforts, despite, of course, challenges they face. I think they need to be capacitated and supported. Finally, I see there's a need to develop a holistic and inclusive approach that ensures that no one is left behind. In the Agenda 2016, 2063, and Development Agenda 2030 that have placed women and youth at the center of their aspirations. It goes without saying that collaboration and cooperation with various institutions and communities that are active in this field is essential. I participate in various preventive frameworks, including the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity, GAMAC, which was mentioned in your report, Mr. Secretary General. This is a global, inclusive, state-led network of partners with the support of the Swiss government, which is involved in atrocity prevention. It intends to support states that wish to develop national architectures for prevention of atrocity crimes. I invite you to work closely with such institutions. And finally, dialogue and mediation are vital soft power approaches that should be engaged as the Council reflects on the centrality and value of preventive diplomacy. As a woman peace activist and champion of women leadership, Mr. President, the subject that I teach, let me conclude here by saying that nothing about us without us. This is a famous say in Burundi. Mr. Secretary General, we are here and ready and willing to be deployed in any peace mission, in any mediation, in any peacekeeping forces. Don't look far. The African Women Leaders Network and FEMWISE are at your disposal, Mr. Secretary General, when you are searching for able and qualified women to assist in your good offices and diplomatic efforts. The South African legendary singer, Yvonne Chaka Chaka, defined women, Mr. Secretary General, as well-organized men. So we are together in this. I thank you once again, Mr. President, for the opportunity. Amandra, aluta continua. Thank you.
I want to thank Her Excellency Ms. Mulla for her briefing. And I give the floor to Ms. Naledi Mitre.
Good morning, Mr. President, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address the Council. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Naledi Mitre, and I represent an organization called the South African Women in Dialogue, commonly known as SAWID, which I became affiliated with at the age of 18. SAWID is an independent South African women's forum which is committed to providing a platform for every woman to be heard through dialogue in order to improve the status of women in our country. SAWID was born out of an organic process of sisterhood and solidarity. The journey began in 2002 during the time of the Inter-Congolese Peace Dialogue, which took place in Sun City, a conferencing and holidaying resort in South Africa. As you may recall, Mr. President, this was the second attempt as the initial dialogue in Ethiopia had collapsed. We as South Africans, as with the rest of the world, watched the proceedings on our television screens, hoping that finally a common peace agreement would be achieved. However, the marked absence of ordinary South Africans in and around these talks gave a group of women the idea to organize themselves, and they drove to Sun City. On their arrival, the intention was not to meddle in the affairs of the Congo, but they came with one very simple message. We have come to pledge our solidarity with the struggle of the women of the DRC. For them, it was agonizing watching the tensions and anxieties amongst the women who were participating in the ICD process, and how these women were not central but periphery to these talks. As recognized by Resolution 1325, in times of conflict, it is women and children who are the worst affected. Having experienced their own political transition just 8 years prior, this handful of South African women understood firsthand for whom the shoe pinches and what it feels like to want peace and yet not to have a voice. The small civil society delegation was well received, and this gave birth to a number of activities. The main one was the Congolese and South African Women Dialogue, which was held in March in Johannesburg in 2003 at the request of the Congolese women, and was also endorsed by the leader of the facilitation team of the ICD, Seki Dumile Masire. This dialogue was attended by approximately 120 Congolese women and approximately 180 South African women. The purpose was twofold. The first was to facilitate dialogue amongst the Congolese women. At the start of the dialogue, tensions were high. As you can imagine, the women came from different warring parties and factions, and as such, dialogue was difficult and almost impossible at the start. Second was for the South African delegation to share experiences and strategies on institutional mechanisms and laws which will provide an environment for women's emancipation and equality in the DRC. Following the success of this dialogue, the Congolese women resolved to hold a follow-up conference which was held in Kinshasa in May 2003. Through this process, they collectively created a framework for the ICD process to integrate women and to ensure effective participation in the transitional process. And through this newly created collective, they pressured the various negotiating parties to sign the final agreement. Through this dialogue, Mr. President, Congolese women, in spite of deep-rooted and historical divisions, demonstrated that even if one is affected or is party to conflict, this does not mean that it is impossible to work towards a common goal, namely that of peace and stability in their country. Emanating from these interactions with the Congolese women was the realization by South African women for the need to reflect on their own journey since achieving democracy. The process with our sisters from the DRC exposed to us that we had assumed the existence of our cohesion and unity, which is not necessarily the case. Women realized that post-1994, they had handed over their agency to government, which created a void, particularly at grassroots level, and that there was an urgent need for a collective voice representing the interests of women in the new South Africa, as well as enabling women to play a more active role in ensuring that we contribute towards nation building and sustaining peace. And this is what led to the birth of the South African Women in Dialogue, which was held in July 2003 and was attended by approximately 1,000 South African women from all walks of life. The carefully crafted dialogue model was based on 3 guiding principles, which were largely influenced from the lessons that we learned from our interactions with our sisters from the DRC. The first was the creation of a non-partisan platform where women were encouraged to express their own individual views and not to represent those of organizations that they are affiliated with. The second was the issue of diverse participation. And this stems from the realization that women are in fact not a homogeneous group and that we are separated by many issues such as ethnicity, religious beliefs, class, political affiliations, just to mention a few. It was also a way to move away from the global tendency of educated and middle-class women setting the agenda for and speaking on behalf of rural and poor urban women. This is the backbone of the model, as no legitimate outcome can come out of a process which is not inclusive. The third guiding principle was the facilitation of a private self-reflective space, away from the glares of the cameras, which enabled women to unburden themselves, albeit momentarily, from current traumas and stresses, which created a communion of sisterhood and shared understanding of our commonalities. This process became the foundation of honest and effective dialogue. From this moment, SAWID grew to become a formidable brand, which was adopted wholeheartedly by South African women. It went on to host 10 national dialogues, which cascaded to many more provincial and community-based dialogues, which adopted the SAWID model. Major local successes of SAWID include the facilitation of the voices and experiences of women to be included in the National Development Plan. SAWID also led and lobbied for the establishment of a women's ministry, as well as lobbied and presented a poverty eradication model which it implemented jointly with government. Under its Pan-African Peace and Reconciliation Dialogue Program, SAWID also went on to facilitate peace dialogues with the women of Burundi in 2004. This was shortly before the elections, as well as with the women of Sudan in 2007. It also facilitated an African peer review mechanism dialogue in 2006, as well as participated in election observer mission in various African countries. Through these dialogues over the years, the efforts of the SAWID Forum can be summarized as having facilitated partnerships between women and national and international bodies to shape community, provincial, national, and continental agendas. Through the use of dialogue, SAWID has contributed to strengthening solidarity and social cohesion with the aims to promote and consolidate peace, security, and stability in local communities and on the continent, and thus creating a conducive space for socio-economic development and the eradication of poverty. In closing, Mr. President, I'd like to emphasize that SAWID believes that dialogue is an important tool for both prevention as well as the overall consolidation of peace in developing and post-conflict societies. Most often, initiatives like SAWID are looked upon as soft approaches of maintaining peace and preventing conflict, and as a result, most conflict strategies neglect these initiatives, often prioritizing the development of their militaries, infrastructure development, and other development priorities. Yes, these are important issues to prioritize. However, it is essential for governments to recognize that the project of rebuilding societal links, acknowledging the pain and trauma of citizens, and actively investing in the healing of nations is also of paramount importance and is by no means a soft matter. Investing in constructive dialogue mechanisms at all levels of society may be a saving grace for fragile and volatile communities. However, we would like to caution that despite its efficacy, these dialogues should not be a grand once-off effort. Our biggest lesson from the SAWID interventions is that dialogue must be consistent and sustained in time. Otherwise, the positive benefits of the understanding and agreements reached at the dialogue can be diluted and violence can re-emerge. SAWID has been progressively evolving and continues to champion the interests of South African women. However, due to a lack of adequate resourcing, its scope has been dwindling. This waned presence has once again created a void, and South African women are yearning for its renewed revival. The rate of violence against women and children, including femicide and rape, have reached unprecedented levels in South Africa, and our low ranking on the Global Peace Index are just a few indicators of why initiatives like the SAWID Forum must be preserved, especially at grassroots level. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Mitre for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Linda Vilakazi.
Good morning, Mr. President, and let me also add my gratitude for the opportunity to brief Council. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As already said, my name is Linda Vilakazi. I come from South Africa in Johannesburg. I'm an African and care deeply about the equal treatment of all people, in particular women's inclusion at all levels of society. I work for the Zanele Development Trust, where I coordinate the African Women in Dialogue platform, which was launched in 2018. Our collective experience gained through the successful 16-year-long journey of the South African Women in Dialogue platform, as already told by my colleague, Ms. Naledi Maite, led to the realization that an impressive number of African women occupy various important positions at local and global stages, which we applaud and celebrate. However, we noted that as a continent, we haven't as yet built a mechanism to help us access and utilize their experience and expertise to the benefit of all. This even made it more pronounced to us that as a continent, we do lack a mechanism to meet as African women on African soil. Often, we are convened by others outside the continent at their expense and their agenda. For an example, we meet at the annual Davos World Economic Forums, we meet at the UN Commission on the Status of Women and many other platforms. Although such exposure is necessary, its outcomes seldomly translates into real value for the masses of Africans back home, in particular the marginalized women. This realization motivated us to take the SAWID model, as shared earlier by my colleague, to the continent. So in November 2018, from the 19th to the 23rd, backed by many African women, we successfully launched the African Women in Dialogue platform, held over 5 days, attended by 1,000 women from 16 Southern African Development Community countries and beyond. It was held in Johannesburg, South Africa. Bolstered by this successful inaugural launch, we are now ready this year to host the 2019 dialogue, to be attended by yet another cohort of 1,000 women coming now from all 55 African countries. This is an unprecedented achievement, setting the bar for future dialogues. Similarly to the SAWID model, the African Women in Dialogue platform is designed to be inclusive, open to all, non-hierarchical, and non-partisan. Our inclusivity guide insists on a 60% attendance by grassroots women and marginalized women. These are the women we often speak about and purport to represent. Our aim is to bring them into the room, for their experience, voice, and power is part of the essential ingredients necessary to help us unite, heal our continent towards a peaceful coexistence. Women attend as individuals at this dialogue, not representing any specific mandate except our personal views, using these to find solutions to our various struggles. At the dialogue, all women are treated as equals, with no class levels. We do not stand on ceremony. yet we do recognize the experiences brought by each woman in the room. The Awid Week, as such, becomes a festival of ideas guided by an agenda for a peaceful, just, and better continent, with women connecting, learning from each other, sharing as they showcase incredible work by women from villages, towns, and communities across the continent. Our model is simple, yet requiring of patience, resourcing, and appreciation of the individualness of each woman attending. The model requires conscious and deliberate attention to the requisite support needed to maximize each participant's presence and contribution. Of course, beyond the 5-day dialogue, the platform seeks to continue an ongoing chain of women connected throughout the years using dialogue to overcome barriers and find solutions. We do this work fully aware that it is no easy task. It is expensive, complex, shrouded in stereotypes, and requires hard work. As my colleague Ms. Mitre already alluded, dialogue has the benefit to help us rise above our differences and seek that which binds us. It is proven that dialogue spaces can be used as platforms for development whilst acting as preventative systems for potential conflict and can bring about post-conflict resolution. As such, the agenda for our 2019 5-day dialogue attests to this, as we cover a broad range of topics from entrepreneurship to women's economic opportunities to unpacking the fourth industrial revolution opportunities, challenges, and even the inherent threats, to discussing issues of African feminism. We even train women on how to use dialogue as a tool for mediation. We attend to self-mastery discussions, as well as this year we'll be reviewing the UNSCR Resolution 35, as well as the Beijing Plus 25, amongst many others we discussed over that time. As we speak now, the team back home is finalizing logistics for this unparalleled November 4th to 8th Dialogue 2019. It is possible that some of the African leaders present in this meeting are bound to hear of the group of women back home challenging your officials to provide them with travel documents to go join other African women in Johannesburg. Some of these women have never traveled outside of their villages, and such at first they have to apply for a birth certificate, then a passport, and finally a visa, which are issues of identity and are still central to building peace in this continent. All of this is taxing and expensive, both financially, emotionally, and in time. So please do lend a hand if you come across such requests. In essence, the African Women in Dialogue platform presents a unique, much-needed opportunity for all of us to be authentic about the involvement of African women in their diversities as active players in conflict prevention and preventative diplomacy. It is a known fact that the ongoing conflict in Africa continues to form the bulk of items on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council, and we wish to change this for the better. We therefore seek your support as Council, that through your multilateral agreements, you help support and enable the African Women in Dialogue processes as located at villages, communities, and country levels. The commitments made by this body under the agenda, Peace and Security in Africa towards silencing guns by 2020, will remain an elusive ideal, amongst others, if women and youth are not adequately engaged as co-participants in the ongoing peace-building process. Article 33, Chapter 6 of the UN Charter states that parties to a dispute shall seek a solution through political means, including negotiation and mediation. For this to happen, we argue that supporting inclusive dialogues, as in the model of the African Women in Dialogue platform, should be the tool used to fulfill this article. It is apparent that preventative diplomacy is and has been utilized by the UN system at large, and the Office of the SG in particular through its good office role. However, this has not always been regarded as a central pillar of the work of the Security Council. We therefore, as African women, offer that through the African Women in Dialogue platform, this pillar can come to fruition, arguing or urging you to join us as civil society and support grassroots level dialogues led by women in their diversities and oneness. We hope that following this briefing, the UN Security Council will resolve to embrace, support, and adopt the practices of inclusive dialogue as a credible, viable tool for preventative diplomacy, and thereby implore others to do the same. In conclusion, Mr. President, it is our conviction that through this platform, African countries can build and maintain peace by engaging with all women as they operate from their local spaces, connected with others by having participated at the annual dialogue platform. In the final analysis, the objective is to let communities own and drive their peace process, making this a lasting principle that underpins engagement for development and builds social cohesion over African borders. Mr. President, this is our story, our journey, our resolve to convene annually as African women on African soil, driven by an African agenda for inclusive development and maintenance of peace in our communities. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Vilakazi for her briefing. I now give the floor to the council members who want to talk. I now give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. في البداية
Thank you, President. We'd like to preface our remarks by expressing our full gratitude to you for convening this morning's meeting, which addresses a crucial and important...
All right, so that's the debate on peace and security in Africa, of course, currently taking place at the United Nations Security Council. A number of speakers there.
Through mediation is one of the tools that we have as civilization to resolve international disputes through constructive dialogue, and this is a tool that is provided for by the Charter. The Charter gives us with a range of tools to be resolving disputes on a peaceful basis. I'm thinking in particular of the provisions under Chapter 6 of the Charter of the United Nations, a chapter which provides for measures to resolve disputes between opposing parties through investigation, mediation, reconciliation, arbitration, judicial resolution, or through resorting to regional international organizations as well as other tools for peace. We saw this in the recent history of Ethiopia, and the African Union helped parties in Sudan to reach a transitional agreement between the Transitional Military Council and the Forces of Freedom. President, the Charter under Chapter 6 provides for a preventive role to be played by the Security Council. The Security Council has the prerogative and responsibility of finding a resolution to conflict, to prevent international tension, and to prevent any provocation or spread of tension or dispute. The Security Council needs to be convinced that such a dispute would pose a threat to international peace and security, but once it is convinced of same, it is empowered to act. Chapter 8 talks about partnership to arrive at a peaceful resolution with regional and sub-regional organizations, and this is very helpful because of their proximity to the theaters of these disputes. I'd like to pay tribute to the cooperation that exists between the African Union and the United Nations, which we have arrived at under Chapter 8 of the Charter. As we're all familiar with, the cooperation between these two bodies is ever-growing and evergreen. We particularly welcome the degree of cooperation between the United Nations Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council. Annual regular meetings are held between our bodies, and we look forward to participating in the 13th Annual Consultative Meeting that will take place in Addis Ababa in the latter half of this month of October. I think it worth also pointing to the cooperation that exists between the African Union and the Peace-Building Commission, and we hope to build upon this experience, particularly thanks to peacekeeping initiatives that are intended to allow peacekeeping missions and operations to be more effective and efficient and to be better resourced and equipped. It is essential that the Security Council establishes strong and robust mandates for its peacekeeping operations and also provides for a long-term predictable financing for these missions, for these mandates. We also need to build on the determination of the African Union to meet 25% of the costs of these peacekeeping missions in Africa. We hope we can soon arrive at a decision to arrive at the financing of African peace support operations or peace missions. The Secretary General of the United Nations, under Article 19 of the Charter, has available to him a tool for preventing the breaking out of conflicts through the use of his good offices or through the dispatch of envoys or representatives of his office, who can be dispatched to any region affected by conflict. This tool, available to the Secretary General of the United Nations, has allowed him, since he took up office, to establish a Supreme Advisory Council for mediation and preventive diplomacy, intended to prevent the breaking out of conflicts in the first place, and we welcome that step. We pay particular tribute to the role played by the Special Envoys and Special Representatives of the Secretary General. Given the importance that we attach to preventive diplomacy and its noble goals and purposes, last June we organised a briefing, a high-level briefing, that is, on conflict prevention and mediation in the context of peacekeeping. We wish to underscore once again the importance of promoting the central preventive role of mediation. We also wish to underscore the need to ensure cooperation between the United Nations and regional and sub-regional bodies. We are convinced that the Security Council can and should play a key role in adopting preventive measures under the Charter, such as the dispatch of small missions comprising a few members of the Security Council, which can be dispatched to the field before a full-scale mission should that become necessary. The Security Council, with the experience that it has accumulated over the last 74 years, and thanks to the lessons it's been able to draw from that experience, thanks to its institutional memory, in other words, could take innovative measures to prevent the breaking out of conflicts in the first place, taking the guise of mediation to guarantee international peace. This could be through missions dispatched to the field, but also through sanctions imposed on bodies and individuals. Rapid intervention is vital in order to ensure better results and to ensure a better chance for prevention. If we are to act more effectively and efficiently, we will need the resources in place, but acting more effectively and earlier will ensure loss of human lives.
I give the floor to the Minister of Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, ma délégation salue la tenue de ce débat sur l'importance de la diplomatie préventive dans la prévention et le règlement des conflits qui cadre parfaitement avec les priorités définies par les Nations Unies et l'Union africaine dans le cadre de leur partenariat renforcé en matière de paix et de sécurité. Je félicite M. Antonio Guterres, secrétaire général des Nations Unies, et les différents briefers pour leurs exposés qui éclairent notre conseil, entre autres, sur la qualité et la coopération entre les deux institutions. La délégation salue également la participation des représentants de la société civile à ce débat ainsi que la pertinence de leur présentation. Monsieur le Président, la signature le 19 avril 2017 du cadre stratégique pour un partenariat renforcé en matière de paix et de sécurité par les Nations Unies et l'Union africaine institutionnalise une coopération plus prévisible, systématique et stratégique entre ces deux organisations. Cet instrument leur permet d'intervenir rapidement, de manière cohérente et décisive.
This instrument has allowed us both to intervene more rapidly, coherently and decisively to prevent and manage and resolve conflicts on the continent. My delegation statement will focus on 3 points in particular: to wit, the importance of early warning and rapid response mechanisms as tools for the prediction of and prevention of conflicts. Secondly, the need to support efforts of regional and sub-regional organizations in the areas of mediation and peacekeeping and peace building. And thirdly, the importance of an inclusive approach, bringing on board civil
règlement
society,
des
women and
conflits.
young
Monsieur
people,
le
and the
Président,
prevention and resolution of
la nouvelle
conflict.
typologie des
President,
menaces à la paix
the
et à la
emerging
sécurité en
types of
Afrique
threats to peace and
nécessitent une
security in
coordination
Africa
des
necessitate a
interventions de
coordinated
plusieurs
response
acteurs,
between several
notamment les
stakeholders,
Nations Unies,
chief
l'Union
among them the
africaine, les
United
organisations
Nations, the African
sous-régionales et la
Union,
société
sub-regional
civile.
organizations and civil
Les efforts
society.
déployés par ces
The efforts
acteurs dans le cadre
undertaken
d'une
by these
approche
stakeholders in the
préventive
framework of
ne seront
a preventive
efficaces que
approach
s'ils reposent
will
sur
only succeed
l'identification
if they
des
are
signes
underpinned
précurseurs
by
des
an
conflits
ability to identify
grâce
the
à
warning
divers
signs that
indicateurs
are precursors
sociopolitiques,
of
économiques,
conflict,
climatiques
tapping
et
into
environnementaux.
various socio-political,
C'est à cette
economic,
condition
climate-related
qu'ils
and
pourront
environmental
prévenir la survenance des
indicators
crises
to reach their
ou
conclusions.
lorsqu'elles
Only
ont
if these
déjà
conditions
éclaté,
are
leur
in place
apporter des réponses
will we be able to
efficaces et
prevent
pérennes.
the breaking out of crises, or in
En
those
plaçant le
cases where they
système
have already
continental
broken
d'alerte
out,
précoce
be
au
able to
cœur
find
de
effective and
l'architecture
lasting
africaine de paix et de
responses there
sécurité,
too.
l'Union
In
africaine
placing the
démontre sa volonté d'accroître ses
continental
capacités
early warning
d'anticipation et
system
de
at the heart of
prévention
the
des
African
conflits.
peace and security
Son
architecture, the
interaction avec
African
les
Union
systèmes
has
d'alerte
demonstrated
précoce et
its
de réponse
determination to
rapide des communautés
boost its
économiques
capacity to
régionales,
anticipate and
lui
prevent
permet
conflicts.
ainsi d'identifier
The
les
African
prémices et
continental
les causes
early
structurelles
warning
profondes
systems
des conflits
interface with
et de mieux structurer ses actions de
the
prévention.
early warning rapid
Dans la même
response
volonté d'anticipation,
warning
la
systems
communauté des
of
États d'Afrique
regional
de
economic
l'Ouest,
communities has
CEDEAO,
allowed the African
s'est
continental
doté
early
d'un
warning
mécanisme d'alerte
system to
précoce
identify
dénommé
underlying
EcoWarn,
structural and root
qui en
causes of conflicts
synergie
and to
avec
better
ses
adapt its prevention
prolongements dans les États
activities.
membres lui a permis, au
In
cours
this
des
same
dernières
spirit of
années,
anticipation and
de
prevention,
mener de nombreuses actions de
ECOWAS has
diplomatie
established its
préventive.
own early warning
Les
system
alertes en
called
période
ECOWARN,
préélectorale
which,
ou
matching
lorsque
the
des
pace of rollout
tensions
amongst
politiques
member
internes
states,
menacent de se
has
transformer
been
en conflit
positioned
ouvert,
over the last few years
donne lieu à
to
des
be able to
missions de
engage in
médiation et
numerous
de bons
preventive
offices
diplomacy
auprès des acteurs
activities.
politiques et des
Warnings
organisations de
in
la société
pre-electoral
civile des
periods
pays concernés.
or at times
Dans
when
l'ensemble,
domestic
en
political
dépit des
tensions
nombreux
risk spilling
défis
over into
auxquels ils
outright
sont
conflict,
confrontés,
have paved the way for
notamment les
mediation and good
disparités
offices
et la faible
missions engaging with
coordination entre
political
les systèmes
stakeholders and
centraux,
civil society
régionaux et
organizations in
nationaux,
countries concerned.
et le fossé entre
Overall,
l'alerte et
despite
la
the many
réponse rapide,
challenges
les systèmes
with which
d'alerte
it is
précoce de
confronted,
l'Union africaine
particularly
et des organisations
disparities in
sous-régionales,
and subpar
ont
coordination
réalisé
between the central,
d'importants
regional
progrès.
and national
Ils
systems and the
représentent
discrepancy
aujourd'hui
between
des maillons essentiels dans les
alert
dispositifs
and
de
rapid
prévention
response
et de règlement des
capacities.
conflits en Afrique.
Early warning systems
et
of the
méritent à ce
African
titre
Union
d'être
and
soutenus.
sub-regional organizations have made major
Monsieur le
strides
Président, mon
forward.
pays
They
est
represent
d'avis que
today
pour être
essential
efficace,
links
les efforts de
in the
prévention et de
overall
règlement des
chain of
conflits doivent
prevention and
s'inscrire dans le
conflict
cadre
resolution in
d'une
Africa
démarche
and therefore
collective et
deserve our full
coordonnée
support. President, my country is of
permettant
the
une
view that to be effective
synchronisation
and
des
efficient,
initiatives des
prevention and
Nations
conflict
Unies, de
resolution
l'Union africaine
efforts
et des
must be
organisations
subsumed
sous-régionales.
into the broader
Il
framework of a
en
collective and
va
coordinated
ainsi
approach,
du
allowing for
partenariat entre
harmonization of
l'ONU et
United
l'UA
Nations,
qui
African
porte
Union and
entre autres sur
sub-regional
une appréhension commune des
organizations
causes
initiatives.
profondes des
This also
conflits
holds true
et des
for the
visites
partnership between the
conjointes,
UN
comme
and the
ce fut
African
le
Union,
cas
which
récemment en
focuses
Afrique,
inter alia
en
on
République
arriving at a
centrafricaine
common
et en
understanding
Libye.
of the root causes of conflict
Les actions
and on joint
concertées de
visits,
diplomatie préventive
as we
facilitent le
recently
soutien
saw in
aux
the Central
processus
African
politiques
Republic
de
and in
sortie de
Libya.
crise
These dovetailed
et de
actions of preventive
consolidation de la paix
diplomacy
dans les pays en
facilitate support
situation
for political
post-conflit.
processes to end
La Côte
crises
d'Ivoire
and
se
to
réjouit
build
que
peace
l'extension
in
de cette
post-conflict
dynamique de
countries.
coopération en
Côte
matière
d'Ivoire
de
welcomes
prévention
and
des
hails this
conflits
expansion of
aux
this trend
organisations
of
sous-régionales
cooperation in
africaines.
terms of
C'est à ce
conflict
titre que les
prevention to
représentants de l'Union
encompass, as it
africaine
now
et le
does,
représentant
sub-regional
spécial
African
du secrétaire général,
organizations.
chef du bureau des Nations Unies pour l'Afrique de
It
l'Ouest
is under
et le
this
Sahel,
framework that representatives of the
UNOWAS,
African Union and
prennent
the Special
part aux réunions
Representative
du
of the
Conseil
Secretary
de
General, Head of the
médiation et de
United Nations
sécurité de la
Office
CEDEAO,
for West Africa and the
aux
Sahel,
réunions
UNOWAS, have been
ministérielles
able to
ainsi qu'au
participate
sommet des
in
chefs d'État et de gouvernement, principaux
meetings
organes
of
de
the Mediation
décision
and
sur les
Security
questions de
Council of
paix et de
ECOWAS, as well as
sécurité
in
régionale.
ministerial meetings and in
Il
heads of
salue
state
la
and government, the
collaboration
main decision-making
exemplaire
bodies
entre la
when it comes to
CEDEAO et
issues of regional
l'UNOWAS
peace and security.
qui a donné la pleine mesure de
My
son
country welcomes
efficacité
this
dans la
model
prévention et la
cooperation
gestion
between
des
ECOWAS
crises
and UNOWAS,
à
which has
l'occasion
proven
de
its
leurs
worth
interventions
in terms
successives
of its effectiveness and
en
efficiency in the
Guinée-Bissau,
prevention
au
and
Mali,
management
au
of
Burkina
crises
Faso
through
et en
successive
Gambie.
interventions in Guinea-Bissau,
Cette
Mali,
coopération
Burkina
a en
Faso
effet
and the Gambia.
contribué au
This
renforcement des
cooperation,
capacités
without a shadow
nationales
of
et
a doubt,
régionales
has
de
boosted
résilience au
national
conflit,
and regional
à l'ancrage de
capacity
la
for conflict
démocratie et de la
resilience.
bonne
It has
gouvernance
also helped to further
et à
anchor democracy
l'instauration
and good
d'environnements
governance and
favorables
nurtured
à la
environments that
réalisation des
promote the
objectifs de
achievement of
développement
the
durable.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Monsieur le Président, ma délégation est
President, my
d'avis que la
delegation
prévention
is
des
of the
conflits,
opinion that
à
conflict
travers la
prevention,
construction de sociétés
through the
stables et
forging of
résilientes,
stable and
doit
resilient
nécessairement prendre en
societies,
compte
needs to
l'indispensable
take into
contribution des
account the
organisations
vital
de la société
contribution
civile,
made by civil
des
society
femmes et des jeunes.
organizations, women
Il
and
convient
young
dès lors de
people.
mobiliser les femmes et les jeunes, de tirer le meilleur
We need
parti
to
de leurs
mobilize
énergies
women and young people to
et de leur
harness the potential
créativité
of
en
their
les
energy
impliquant
and their
davantage dans les
creativity by involving
négociations
them
et
more
les processus
closely in
politiques de sortie de
negotiations and
crise,
in political crisis
ainsi que dans
resolution
les actions de
processes,
consolidation de
as
la
well as in
paix,
peace-building
telles que la
actions such
réconciliation
as national
nationale, la
reconciliation,
cohésion sociale,
social
le
cohesion,
processus de
and the
désarmement,
twin processes
démobilisation et
of
réinsertion
disarmament,
DDR,
demobilization and reintegration
et de
DDR
réforme du
and
secteur de
security
la
sector
sécurité
reform or
RSS.
SSR.
Monsieur le Président, pour conclure,
President, to conclude, Côte d'Ivoire reiterates its commitment to multilateralism as the best framework for finding joint responses to the challenges inherent in the maintenance of international peace and security. In that understanding, we reiterate our call for solidarity from the international community and our call for a strengthening of the cooperation and partnership between the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations in their efforts to uphold or restore, as the case may be, peace and stability. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Côte d'Ivoire for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank you for organizing today's event. We're grateful to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his briefing, and also we thank Ambassador Mulla, Ms. Mitre and Ms. Vilakazi for their interesting briefings. We comprehensively support the subject that our South African friends have placed at the center of today's discussion, because indeed the task of preventing armed conflict was placed before the UN and its Security Council back when the organization was founded. Why this task is not being done as it should be is a big question, and perhaps it's a question of political will, or rather the lack of political will. And yet the prevention of armed conflicts, in particular on the African continent, is vitally important in processes of ensuring global stability. Today, now more than ever, preventive diplomacy and its main mechanisms, mediation and good offices, are needed. And indeed, as Ms. Mulla said, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The UN has everything that it needs to serve as a basis to work in this area. Chapters 1 and 6 of the UN Charter, and also a number of other decisions, as well as Security Council Resolution 2171, which enshrine the fundamental principles of international assistance in this area. We welcome the efforts of the Secretary General to strengthen this capacity. An important element of it was the establishment in 2017 of the High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation, made up of authoritative politicians and diplomats. We fully agree with the idea contained in the concept note that the voice of Africa has to be taken into account on issues of peace and security on the continent. And moreover, we are convinced that this voice needs to be a decisive one. It's important for African countries themselves, in accordance with the principle of national ownership, to play an important role in the prevention and resolution of conflicts. The job of the international community is to support these efforts whilst observing state sovereignty in strict compliance with the principle of non-interference in internal affairs. Mr. President, we are pleased to note that in recent years the arsenal of African countries has acquired a whole host of mechanisms and tools for conflict prevention on the continent. They are all included in the African peace and security architecture, the main elements of which are the Panel of the Wise, the Continental Early Warning System, and the African Peace Facility. In executing its mandate to prevent conflicts, the Continental Organization is adhering to the plan of action to build the AU's mediation capacity and the standard operating procedures for mediation support. Important obligations in preventive diplomacy are enshrined in the AU-UN Joint Partnership Framework for Enhanced Partnership in Peace and Security, which was signed in 2017. There are also practical results in this area. In particular, the African Union has made a sizable contribution to achieving comprehensive peace agreements in the CAR and in South Sudan, in holding peaceful and democratic elections in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Nigeria, and improving the situation in the Horn of Africa. Recent examples include the successful work of the Special Envoy of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Mr. Lebat, in stabilizing the situation in Sudan. A substantial role is played by African sub-regional organizations as well, including ECOWAS, IGAD, SADC, and the Economic Community of Central African States. We must also note in this respect the recent success story of the African Union, the UN, SADC, and other partners working together to prevent political crisis in Madagascar. We comprehensively support the strengthening of partnership on these issues between between the UN Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council. In this context, the Security Council Ad Hoc Working Group on Conflict Prevention and Resolution in Africa has a lot of potential. We believe that this cooperation must be carried out based on mutual respect and along the lines of regional initiatives. The basis of preventive diplomacy must be an impartial and balanced approach, and only mediation, which works to bring positions close together, find common ground, and achieve mutually acceptable agreements, has any chance of success. It is necessary to support and maintain dialogue with all constructive players that are involved in a conflict. It is also important to remember the fine line that lies between preventive diplomacy and pressure on internal political processes. Often the only thing that's needed to prevent a conflict is to end interference in internal affairs and refrain from mentoring about how to build democracy and observe human rights. An example of an altogether hapless case of prevention was the NATO operation in Libya, conducted in violation of a Security Council mandate and which led to the emergence of a great many problems in Libya and itself and in the Sahara-Sahel region, and also to the spread of terrorism there. We do not need this sort of prevention. Mr. President, Russia will continue to provide consistent political support to the efforts of the African community to prevent and resolve African conflicts. We stand ready to continue to support Africa in strengthening its own anti-crisis potential, including through the training of peacekeepers and law enforcement officers from African states in Russian training institutions. We trust that the upcoming first ever Russia-Africa Summit will serve as a catalyzer for our cooperation with African countries and give an impetus to the normalization of the situation on the continent. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais commencer par saluer et remercier l'Afrique du Sud pour l'initiative de ce débat. Je remercie aussi le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Son Excellence Madame Mulla et Mesdames Vilakazi et Mitre pour leur mot d'introduction. Pour la Belgique, les organisations régionales et sous-régionales jouent un rôle crucial dans la prévention des conflits, en particulier en Afrique, où l'appropriation des défis sécuritaires du continent a enregistré des progrès incontestables ces 10 dernières années. Lorsqu'une crise pointe à l'horizon, les États voisins, la sous-région et le continent sont souvent les mieux placés pour agir rapidement et efficacement. La Belgique soutient l'intégration régionale. Notre histoire nous a montré que c'est la meilleure manière de régler des problèmes transfrontaliers ou régionaux de façon consensuelle, de souder des régions et de créer des solidarités. Je voudrais insister à nouveau, c'est dans notre intérêt à tous que l'Union africaine renforce ses outils de paix et de sécurité. À terme, les opérations de paix de l'Union africaine devront pouvoir bénéficier d'un financement plus prévisible, plus durable et plus souple. Dans la division des tâches et des responsabilités entre l'ONU et les organisations régionales et sous-régionales, notre approche est guidée par la recherche du modèle le plus adéquat dans le contexte précis. Il y a 2 ans en Gambie, nous avons vu un bel exemple de mise à l'avant-plan d'une organisation sous-régionale. En Guinée-Bissau, la complémentarité se réalise sur le terrain avec l'action du groupe de 5 à Bissau. En République centrafricaine, l'Union africaine a vu ses efforts soutenus par la CEAC et l'ONU. Ces efforts ont abouti à l'accord de paix. Les visites conjointes de haut niveau Union africaine, Nations unies, visites auxquelles participe d'ailleurs un représentant de l'Union européenne, sont du reste un outil efficace de suivi de la situation en RCA. Au Burkina Faso, au Niger et au Nigeria, le Bureau des Nations unies pour l'Afrique de l'Ouest contribue au renforcement des capacités de prévention des conflits entre éleveurs et agriculteurs et des conflits de nature communautaire. Ces questions méritent effectivement une approche régionale sur toute l'Afrique occidentale et nous saluons la détermination affichée par la CEDEAO lors de son sommet extraordinaire tenu le mois dernier à Ouagadougou. En matière de médiation, la complémentarité prend tout son sens. Les organisations régionales ou sous-régionales apportent leurs connaissances et leur expertise locale, alors que les Nations Unies amènent leur neutralité ainsi que l'autorité et des normes universelles. Nous saluons les progrès accomplis dans l'opérationnalisation de l'unité de soutien à la médiation de l'Union africaine et le développement du réseau des femmes médiatrices FEMWISE, dont le secrétaire général et les trois intervenantes viennent également de souligner l'importance capitale. Monsieur le Président, notre responsabilité, c'est de tout faire pour éviter les conflits avant qu'ils n'éclatent. Nous devons poursuivre nos exercices d'alerte précoce et notamment les échanges d'informations entre le Conseil de sécurité et le secrétariat. Mais pour que ces exercices soient utiles, nous devons être aussi ouverts que possible et exclure aucune piste ni aucune information. De nombreux organes et agences des Nations Unies, mais aussi des instituts de recherche, les organisations de la société civile disposent d'éléments extrêmement précieux et détaillés qui peuvent nous renseigner sur certains conflits en gestation. Soyons proactifs. Soyons à leur écoute et intégrons ces informations dans nos délibérations. Mais il faut aller plus loin. L'alerte précoce n'a d'intérêt que si nous nous dotons en même temps d'une capacité de réaction diplomatique rapide. Cette réaction n'est pas nécessairement l'apanage du Conseil de sécurité. C'est aussi les bons offices du secrétaire général, de ses envoyés spéciaux, de ses représentants et des coordinateurs résidents. Ce sont aussi des initiatives indépendantes des Nations Unies, comme au Cameroun en ce moment. Une chose est sûre, nous devons encore approfondir ce chantier. La Belgique est déterminée à s'engager dans cette direction au sein et en dehors du Conseil de sécurité. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank the President of Belgium for her statement. I now give the floor to the President of Peru.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President.
Queremos agradecer la
We'd like to
convocatoria
preface our remarks by thanking you for the convening of this morning's meeting and also expressing our gratitude for the enlightening briefings we've heard from Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the various distinguished
guests who have invited to brief us this debate.
Their statements have
underscored
the critical importance of the primary intent of this House as enshrined in the Charter of this organization, namely the maintenance of international peace and security. And the briefings have also recalled our commitment freely entered into to adopt collective measures to prevent and eradicate, on a just basis, threats to peace. These reminders are particularly apt in a context in which these challenges are arguably more complex and multidimensional than ever before, requiring a necessary shift towards preventive diplomacy both at the global as well as at the regional level, a preventive diplomacy anchored in timely analyses of risk, early warning and conflict management plans. Against that backdrop, we believe it's important to promote greater involvement of regional and sub-regional organizations, both from the preventive perspective as well as when it comes to the promotion of peaceful means for the resolution of disputes. Given that belief, we note with interest that under the framework of the African Architecture for Peace and Security, mechanisms have been established aimed at preventing the escalation of conflict, including the Continental Early Warning System, backed by additional mechanisms that focus on prevention intended to address the structural causes of conflict that entails addressing the root causes of the flare-up of hostilities, as well as mechanisms to promote the 2063 agenda in partnership with the United Nations. It would be very useful to have the option of analyzing the experience acquired under these mechanisms to date, including any potential logistical difficulties encountered when it comes to compiling adequate information for the prevention tasks, as well as the need to have in place predictable and sustainable financing and the need to open up space for greater involvement by the private sector or by global or sub-regional bodies, analyses that could provide a better understanding of what's going on in the ground, in particular in border areas. To that end, we believe that innovative mechanisms aimed at overcoming the potential unwillingness of some states to take a preventive approach to crisis or to improve their policies in some sensitive areas need to be set up. We believe that this work is particularly relevant when it comes to electoral processes and when it comes to peace-building activities and transition processes as a way of avoiding a relapse into instability. It would also be important to twin this approach with the setting up of national early warning systems or the setting up of bodies aimed at promoting options for the easing of tensions with an inclusive approach. We also acknowledge the importance of harnessing mediation as a way of resolving disputes, and this within the broader framework of preventive action. This useful tool enjoys an authentic and real capacity for putting forward positive alternatives for action before and during conflict. And given that mediation will be framed within a mandate agreed by the parties to a conflict, is a tool best placed for avoiding any faux pas or treading on sensitivities. Here we would point to the role played by the political offices of the United Nations as well as their potential to act as a timely source of early warning. It is heartening to see that these mediation activities have been stepped up in various countries in the region over recent years on the basis of successful experiences, and that a mediation support unit has been set up within the African Union. Building on this particular point, we think it's essential to train multidisciplinary mediation teams, including in their ranks women and young people, ensuring, and here I pick up on a point made by our distinguished briefers, Ms. Mulla, Ms. Mitre, Ms. Vilakazi. These multidisciplinary teams would, of course, need to be backed by the necessary logistical and financial support. I'd like to conclude, Mr. President, by underscoring that investment in development and strengthening of regional preventive capacity represents in the current circumstances one of the chief priorities for the effective and efficient exercise of our shared responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Peru for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Well, Mr. President, thank you. It is customary for all Security Council members to thank the President of the day for convening a debate on an important topic when they have chosen one, but I really mean it. Mr. President, preventive diplomacy is a vital tool for this Council in maintaining and restoring international peace and security, and it's a tool we do not use often enough. We cannot simply pay lip service to the primacy of political solutions to conflict, and collectively this Council should be willing to engage with slow-burning political crises before they flare up into open conflict. That's why in the open debate in the UK's presidency last August, we held a debate about mediation. So, Mr. President, thank you for convening this debate on an important issue. Let me pay tribute to the efforts of the African Union and African sub-regional organisations in this regard. The AU took swift and decisive action in June in response to a brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters in Sudan, and the AU's subsequent mediation was crucial in supporting Sudan's transition to civilian-led government. I'm pleased that this Council was ultimately able to express its support for the African Union's position on Sudan in June, thanks in no small measure to the leadership of our African colleagues here on the Council. Our conflict prevention and resolution efforts work best where the United Nations, the African Union, and sub-regional organisations coordinate to leverage their comparative advantages. We've seen this in the Central African Republic, where the United Nations and African Union continue to play a vital role in supporting implementation of the peace agreement. And I hope we will see further such coordinated efforts and actions to encourage peaceful dialogue and political processes. In South Sudan, we urge the regional governments with the African Union, the United Nations and all interested actors to encourage the parties to make further progress in implementing the revitalised peace agreement ahead of the critical 12 November deadline. That should include further direct contact between President Kiir and Riek Machar. And I hope the Security Council is able to play a helpful role during its visit under your leadership, Mr. President, and that of our US colleagues later this month. In Cameroon, the United Kingdom welcomes the national dialogue which took place last week as an initial step to bring parties together to work towards peace. further inclusive discussion about the root causes of grievances is urgently needed, and all parties must take action to address these grievances. We are often asked to ensure space for African organizations to take the lead on African issues, and we therefore call on the African Union and the Economic Community of Central African States, ECAS, to support an inclusive and peaceful resolution to the crisis in Cameroon. And in Burundi, I welcomed our briefer's raising of the situation there. We encourage Burundian and regional actors to work together in the spirit of the Arusha Accords to make progress on a long-term solution to the political crisis ahead of the 2020 elections. And I hope that this Council and the Peace-Building Commission can and will remain fully engaged. Now, Mr. President, there is, of course, no one-size-fits-all approach to conflict prevention and resolution. In some contexts, we can best make headway by ensuring alignment by actors behind UN leadership, avoiding duplication of effort. And that is the case in the United Kingdom's opinion, for example, in Libya, where the international community should follow a single shared roadmap towards the resumption of a political process, aligning behind Special Representative Salame's leadership. Now, this emphatically does not mean marginalizing regional voices. Rather, it means maximizing the United Nations' ability to leverage the support and expertise of all relevant actors, including the African Union, the League of Arab States, and the European Union, behind a successful process. Mr. President, conflict prevention is, of course, preferable to conflict resolution, but that does require effective horizon scanning capacities. So I commend the work of the United Nations Secretariat and the African Union Commission on strengthening their ability to conduct joint analysis and reporting. I also commend DPPA for the useful horizon scanning discussion we held on Latin America some time ago. I hope to see the next one soon and that they take place more frequently hereafter. It is very good, I think, for members of the Council to have an informal opportunity to understand the situation in a range of countries not on the Council's agenda. I also welcome the development of the African Union's Continental Early Warning System, which the United Kingdom is proud to support, including through funding secondee roles within the AU Commission. Mr. President, as we discussed in our debate on mobilizing the youth last week, inclusive approaches to conflict prevention and resolution are key to a lasting peace. This means supporting women peace builders at the grassroots level and ensuring women's meaningful participation in peace processes, mediation, and intercommunal dialogue. And we welcome efforts to this end, such as the AU's FEMWISE network, which the United Kingdom supports enthusiastically, and the Women Mediators Across the Commonwealth initiative, to which the United Kingdom is contributing $1.5 million. We hope that more member states will offer their support to such initiatives, including through supporting the Global Alliance of Women Mediators, launched recently in the margins of High Level Week by the Secretary General, I believe. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias. Quisiéramos agradecer a las oradoras principales las detalladas informaciones suministradas en el día de hoy. Señor Presidente, la diplomacia preventiva se ha convertido en un medio de acción indispensable dentro de las Naciones Unidas. En este sentido, los Estados miembros nos hemos comprometido a crear una cultura de prevención a los fines de tomar medidas de manera colectiva para prevenir y eliminar las amenazas a la paz. Celebramos los avances que hemos alcanzado a través de los establecimientos del sistema de alerta temprana, de los buenos oficios del Secretario General, los enviados especiales, el despliegue de misiones políticas y de paz sobre el terreno y las oficinas regionales, entre otras. A pesar de que las Naciones Unidas cuentan con agentes, herramientas e instrumentos para prevenir la propagación de conflictos y la evolución de la diplomacia preventiva, la tarea de la prevención de conflictos presenta múltiples desafíos que requieren tomar medidas para potenciar al máximo las posibilidades del éxito en la diplomacia.
in our diplomacy. President,
el Consejo de Seguridad tiene responsabilidad
the Security
de
Council
mantener la
bears
paz
the
y la
responsibility
seguridad
of maintaining
internacional y
international
por
peace and
consiguiente juega
security,
un papel
and
preponderante en la
consequently
esfera
plays
de la
a
diplomacia
preeminent
preventiva
role in
y
the
es
sphere of
precisamente
preventive
este
diplomacy.
Consejo
And
a
it
quien le
falls to
corresponde
this very
encontrar
Council
soluciones
the
que
responsibility
permitan
to find
resolver
solutions that
los
will allow for
desafíos
the
que
resolution
presentan
of
las
conflicts
situaciones de
thrown up
crisis.
by crisis
Queremos
situations.
destacar
We would
también
also
la
like to
importancia que
emphasize
representan los
the
organismos
importance
regionales en el
of
arreglo
involving
pacífico
regional
de
bodies in the
controversias
peaceful settlement of
establecidos en el
disputes as
capítulo
duly
8º
provided
de la
for
Carta.
under Chapter 8 of the
Se deben
Charter.
continuar
We must
fortaleciendo las
continue
asociaciones
with our efforts to
estratégicas con
strengthen
las
strategic
organizaciones
partnerships
regionales y
with regional and
subregionales.
sub-regional
El
organizations.
conocimiento sobre el terreno
The
de las
grassroots knowledge
organizaciones
of
regionales son
regional
necesarias
organizations
para la
is
adopción de
vital
medidas
when it comes to
eficaces
adopting
en el marco de
effective
la
and
diplomacia
efficient measures
preventiva.
in the framework of
La
preventive
acción
diplomacy.
colectiva puede ser
Collective
reforzada
action
mediante el involucramiento
will
de las
be enhanced
instancias
through the
regionales
input of
y
regional and
subregionales,
sub-regional bodies, particularly
particularmente en
when
las
it
tareas
comes
de
to the
prevención,
tasks of prevention,
desarrollo y
development,
postconflicto.
and post-conflict recovery.
Señor presidente, la
President,
República
the
Dominicana
Dominican
cree
Republic is a
firmemente
staunch
en la
believer in the
participación
need
de los
to involve
jóvenes
young
en los
people
esfuerzos
in
para la
efforts to stabilize
estabilización de las
societies.
sociedades y en el gran
And we
potencial
are
de la
an equally
mujer
firm
para
proponent
transformar
of the major
sociedades
potential
y
of
contribuir
women
a la
to
paz,
transform
por lo que su
societies for the better
participación
and to
es
contribute to
fundamental
peace,
en
for
todos
which
los
reasons
aspectos
the
de
participation of
solución
women
de
and young
controversias.
people is crucial in all
Señor
aspects
presidente,
of dispute
resaltamos la
resolution.
importancia de la
President, we wish
iniciativa de
to
silenciar
underscore
las
the
armas en
importance
África
of the
para el 2020,
Silencing the
por lo
Guns
que
in Africa
damos la
initiative
bienvenida
by
a los
2020.
progresos
And in this
obtenidos
vein, we
por los
welcome the
Estados
progress that
miembros de
has
la
been
Unión
made
Africana
by the member
en la
states of the African
implementación de
Union
la hoja
in the
de
implementation
ruta de
of the
pasos
roadmap of
prácticos
practical
para
steps
alcanzar
for
este
achieving
objetivo
this
general.
broad goal of silencing the guns
Es
in Africa by
necesario
2020.
redoblar los
There is
esfuerzos
a
para
pressing
continuar
need to
apoyando a
redouble
la región
efforts
en
to
esta
continue
tarea,
supporting the region in this
considerando que
noble
las
task,
aspiraciones a
given
la
that
paz,
the
la
aspirations for
seguridad
peace,
y la estabilidad
security,
en
and
África
stability in
y los
Africa
objetivos de desarrollo
and the sustainable
sostenible
development goals are
constituyen
twin
prioridades
priorities
comunes
duly
esbozadas
captured
en
in
la Agenda
the African Union's
2063 de la Unión
2063
Africana
agenda
y la Agenda
and indeed
2030
and of
para
course
el
in
desarrollo
the 2030
sostenible que
agenda for
constituyen
sustainable
una
development.
alianza reforzada en
Agendas
materia
which
de paz
represent
y
as
seguridad de
tools
la
a
región.
re-galvanized platform
Señor
for the pursuit
presidente,
of peace and
por
security
último,
in the region.
debemos
President,
identificar y atacar
finally, we need
la
to
raíz
identify and
social
address the
de la
social
violencia.
causes of violence.
A medida de que la
Even as the
comunidad
international
continúa
community
luchando para hacer
strives
frente a
on the
los
one hand to
conflictos
contain
desestabilizadores
destabilizing
y sus
conflicts
repercusiones,
and to
se
mitigate their
necesita el
repercussions, we need to
establecimiento de
concurrently
directrices
establish
para la
guidelines for a
participación
ramped-up
escalada de las
participation
Naciones
of the
Unidas
United Nations
en los conflictos.
in conflict prevention
El
as well as
trabajo de
resolution.
prevención requiere
The
un
task of
compromiso
prevention
político
requires
por parte
political
de los
buy-in and
actores
commitment by
relevantes para
stakeholders
abordar
in order to
situaciones
address
que,
situations
debido a
which,
su
due
carácter,
to their
suponen el
nature,
riesgo de un
pose
resurgimiento
the
o un
risk of a
retorno al
resurgence or a return
En
to
ese
conflict.
sentido,
In
la
that
República
understanding,
Dominicana
the Dominican
reitera su
Republic
compromiso
reiterates
con
its
la
own
paz
commitment to
internacional
international
y
peace
la
and
seguridad,
to security,
que es el objetivo
which
hacia
is
el
the
cual
common
debemos
goal
trabajar
towards
juntos
which we must
para
all
que las
strive in
Naciones
order to
Unidas
ensure that the
puedan
United
cumplir
Nations
sus
can
tareas
achieve
básicas
its
de
core
manera
goals
coherente.
consistently and coherently. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to all briefers for the interesting presentations. Mr. President, first of all, let me start by saying that we very much welcome the Secretary General's strong commitment to conflict prevention and resolution, including mediation. We highly appreciate the work of the UN through good offices, special political missions, and mediation support, which often remains invisible and often does not hit the news, but is highly important for conflict resolution and prevention. Germany is very committed to this agenda and tries everything in our power to support these efforts in very concrete terms. Let me give two examples. First of all, the Peacebuilding Fund is one example of successful efforts to have a quick impact and incentivize further funding in a number of African conflicts. Germany just announced a second contribution of 15 million euros for 2019, bringing our contribution to a total of 30 million euros for this year alone. Secondly, mediation. Mediation is a key instrument for advancing the peaceful resolution of conflicts. We believe that the UN, and in particular its mediation support unit, should remain a strong mediation actor. The UN Secretariat, the Mediation Support Unit, and the Group of Friends of Mediation have contributed greatly to the promotion of high standards and professional approaches in the field of mediation, an effort we fully support. In addition to being one of the main donors to the Mediation Support Unit, we are the largest donor to the joint UNDPPA and UNDP Conflict Prevention Program, the so-called PDA program. Mr. President, we thank you for having put this topic on today's agenda, and we are discussing the centrality of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention and resolution in the context of peace and security in Africa. I think the central question in this discussion is, how can the Security Council become more efficient in preventing violent conflict in exactly that context? And I think our briefers have basically given the answer today by pointing out that we need an inclusive and multi-track approach. To prevent conflict, to make peace, and for peace building, we need two things basically. We need to involve all relevant stakeholders, and we need to cover all relevant aspects of conflict. Let me start by making a few remarks on the relevant aspects that we need to take into consideration. First of all, we need early warning and early action. When we want to act early, we can only do so successfully, and we can only successfully prevent crises if we have sufficient and relevant information. Information needs to be fed into the Council in order to react early on to upcoming challenges. And we would like to encourage all Security Council members to regularly invite civil society briefers to give us input to that end. Secondly, human rights and conflict prevention. We need clear awareness of human rights because these situations are often crucial in conflict prevention. And a clear awareness of human rights situations helps identify grievances that, if left unaddressed, can lead to conflict. Human rights standards provide a framework to devise sustainable solutions to address these grievances. Thirdly, the security implications of climate change. Many briefers and also the Secretary General have referred to this in their briefings. Be it conflicts between herders and farmers in the Sahel, disputes over scarce resources, especially water, or food insecurity or vulnerabilities that are exploited by terrorist groups. Mitigating and countering climate change and its effects must be a key component of our stabilization and conflict prevention efforts. We believe that the specific security implications need to be better reflected in this Council's work. And the last word on relevant aspects, we need to take into account sustainable development. Although usually not the topic of this Council, I think we have to be aware that sustainable development is an end in itself, but it is also one of the most effective tools we have to prevent violent conflict. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is our roadmap to create resilient, stable societies and to address the root causes of violence of all kinds. Now, Mr. President, apart from the relevant aspects we need to take into consideration, we need also to involve all relevant stakeholders when we want to be successful in conflict prevention. And we need a special emphasis on civil society and mainstreaming women's rights and gender equality across our prevention and mediation work. In this context, regional women's mediators networks like the African Union's FEMWISE Africa Network or the African Women's Leaders Network are very important developments that we very much applaud and welcome. The protection of children's rights and the involvement of youth are equally important. But when we talk about concrete cooperation on a broader scale, on a strategic scale, of course, the UN's cooperation with the African Union is undoubtedly the most important partnership that comes to mind when we talk about building and sustaining peace and security on the African continent. Germany, jointly with our African partners, is committed to supporting and further developing the UN-AU partnership, and we would like to see this partnership develop further to address all phases of conflict, from prevention of peace operations to post-conflict peace building. African ownership and expertise is crucial for addressing conflicts on the continent. And we support African initiatives in that regard, such as silencing the guns, or the push by African states for stronger integration of AU and UN peacekeeping efforts. We believe that regional organizations in Africa, both the AU and others like ECOWAS and IGAD, to name but a few, can and should play a much stronger role in preventing conflict and addressing root causes. And the increased cooperation between the UN Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council should be at the center of this effort. This is why we very much welcome and look forward to the annual joint consultative meeting planned later this month in Addis Ababa. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister of Germany for his statement. I now give the floor to the Minister of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr.
Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier le secrétaire général pour son exposé, ainsi que nos trois invités pour leurs interventions. Il est plus que jamais nécessaire d'investir davantage dans la prévention des conflits. Les auteurs de la Charte des Nations Unies avaient donné au Conseil de sécurité un mandat clair en la matière. Mais force est de constater que nous nous penchons essentiellement sur les crises ouvertes, au lieu de chercher à prévenir celles de demain. Or, nous le savons, investir en amont des conflits est beaucoup moins coûteux en vies humaines, en souffrance bien entendu, mais aussi financièrement. Des efforts importants ont été réalisés ces dernières années. Je tiens à saluer à cet égard l'élan donné par le secrétaire général en faveur d'une montée en puissance de la diplomatie de la paix et les réformes engagés pour rendre le système des Nations Unies plus efficace en la matière. Renforcement des capacités en matière de médiation, rôle d'alerte précoce confié aux équipes pays. Je souhaite aussi saluer le travail mené par le bureau d'Adama Dieng, conseiller spécial pour la prévention du génocide. Cette nouvelle dynamique a connu ces dernières années des succès indéniables. À Madagascar, l'an dernier, la médiation menée par le conseiller spécial du secrétaire général, Abdoulaye Bathily, en étroite coordination avec l'Union africaine et la SADC, a permis par exemple d'éviter une crise politique grave. Mais nous pouvons faire davantage. Le Conseil de sécurité devrait plus souvent se saisir des situations qui présentent des risques de conflit. C'est d'ailleurs dans cet esprit que nous restons vigilants sur la situation au Burundi, car une déstabilisation de ce pays aurait des conséquences tragiques sur la paix et la sécurité de toute cette région. La Commission de consolidation de la paix devrait également se pencher davantage sur les situations présentant des risques et faire des recommandations au Conseil de sécurité. Sa réunion récente sur le Burkina Faso a montré à quel point cette enceinte permet de nouer un dialogue constructif avec les pays en situation de fragilité. Un des grands défis contemporains, pour mieux prévenir les conflits, est de prendre en compte les risques climatiques. Le système des Nations Unies doit pouvoir disposer d'un panorama complet des risques d'impact du changement climatique pour la sécurité internationale. Nous recommandons donc la rédaction d'un rapport du secrétaire général afin de fournir une évaluation régulière de ces risques ainsi que des recommandations concrètes. Nous devons enfin promouvoir une participation significative des femmes, des jeunes et des sociétés civiles au processus de médiation et de prévention des conflits. Je salue à cet égard la contribution du réseau FEMWISE Africa qui permet justement de déployer des femmes médiatrices sur le terrain. Monsieur le Président, nous devons par ailleurs travailler plus étroitement encore avec les organisations régionales et sous-régionales africaines. Le renforcement du partenariat entre les Nations Unies et l'Union africaine, sous l'égide du chapitre 8 de la Charte, contribue à renforcer l'efficacité de notre diplomatie préventive. Ce partenariat revêt pour nous une importance stratégique et nous sommes donc déterminés à le soutenir. Ainsi, au Burkina Faso en 2015, en Gambie en 2016, l'action coordonnée et unie
the coordinated and unified action of the United Nations, the African Union and ECOWAS ensured success. At the beginning of this year, in the Central African Republic, the United Nations and the African Union together facilitated the negotiation of a peace agreement, thanks notably to the strong and perfectly coordinated engagement of Jean-Pierre Lacroix and Ismail Cherki. It is indeed essential that we better coordinate our efforts. In Sudan, it was the African Union and Ethiopia that were best able to get an agreement. The United Nations and all of Sudan's friends supported this mediation, whilst at the same time being careful not to create interference. African sub-regional organizations also play a frontline role. I have in mind the efforts of IGAD, which allowed for the signing of the revitalized peace agreement in South Sudan a year ago. Preventive diplomacy in Africa requires us to make use of all of the tools available in a spirit of partnership and with half an eye on effectiveness. And it is in this mindset that France works with its African partners. Rest assured, Mr. President, that France shall continue to do so. Thank you.
I thank the President of France for his statement, and I'll give the floor to the President of China.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，中方感谢南非倡议召开此次公开会议。
Mr. President, China thanks South Africa for the initiative to convene this open meeting. We have listened attentively to the briefings by the Secretary General and representatives of civil society. Peace and security in Africa are not only relevant to the well-being of the African people, but also closely related to peace and stability in the world. Helping Africa achieve peace and stability and security is a common aspiration of the African people, as well as the responsibility, unshakable responsibility of the international community. Particularly the Security Council. Preventive diplomacy is an important means of maintaining international peace and security. On how to put preventive diplomacy to good use, I would like to make the following points. Fully leveraging the role of African countries in solving African problems. All countries should uphold the principles of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. We should fully trust the African countries and have confidence in them, with our countries taking the initiative to solve their problems. Prevention should be carried out while respecting the will of the countries concerned and insisting on the ownership of the country in question. We should fully leverage the unique roles of regional organizations such as the African Union, remaining committed to addressing African issues through political and diplomatic means. We must make good use of Chapter 6 of the UN Charter and the role of the United Nations good officers and mediation. We must avoid taking measures by invoking Chapter 7 of the Charter at every turn. The mediators and parties to conflicts and disputes should form a sense of a community of shared destiny, tackle difficult problems through dialogue, promote security through cooperation, respect, and accommodate each other's legitimate concerns, and fully leverage the roles of women and youth, shape a culture of peace, and settle differences by seeking common ground while putting aside disagreements. Attention great importance to addressing the root causes of peace and security in Africa. We must put economic and social development at the forefront, and through developing prevention and mitigation of social risks, lay a solid foundation for lasting stability. Countries should help Africa achieve development through pragmatic action. China is willing to dovetail the joint building of the Belt and Road with the AU 2063 agenda, the UN's Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, and the development strategies of African countries. Help African countries strengthen connectivity, enhance their development capabilities, and promote peace through inclusive development. Mr. President, China has never been absent from efforts to help Africa maintain peace and security. As we speak, more than 2,000 Chinese peacekeepers are safeguarding peace in 5 UN mission areas in Africa. The Chinese Navy has been escorting navigation in the Gulf of Aden and the Somali waters for more than 10 years. It has completed a total of more than 1,200 escort assignments for more than 6,700 vessels. During the Beijing summit of the China-Africa Forum on Cooperation last year, China decided to implement the China-Africa Peace and Security Cooperation Plan and establish a China-Africa Peace and Security Forum to provide a platform for exchanges in the field of peace and security. We established the China-Africa Peace and Security Cooperation Fund to support cooperation between the two parties in peace, security, peacekeeping and stabilization. The first tranche of military assistance materials worth 200 million yuan of RMB has arrived in Africa to support the construction of the African Standby Force and the African capacity for immediate response to crisis. We have also provided 300 million yuan in aid for the counter-terrorism operation in the Sahel and the construction of the 5-nation joint forces. We have actively supported the good offices and mediation of the United Nations by making donations over many years to the UN prevention efforts. Additionally, through the China UN Peace and Development Fund, we have also provided support to the UN mediation mechanisms, including the Secretary General's high-level advisory board on mediation and EBPA's crisis response system. The Chinese people have always shared the same breath and destiny with the people of Africa. We always respect, love, and support Africa. On the path to achieving peace and development in Africa, China will continue to stand firmly with Africa and march together, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the President of China for his statement, and now give the floor to the President of Equatorial Guinea.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President.
Nuestra intervención se alinea a las que van a hacer la señora embajadora Fátima Kiari Mohamed, representante permanente de la misión de observación de la Unión Africana, y la señora Jeanne d'Arc Biaye, observadora permanente de la Comunidad Económica de los Estados de África Central ante las Naciones Unidas. Señor presidente, permítame felicitar y comentar a la delegación de Sudáfrica por haber incluido este importante debate abierto tan pertinente y oportuno en la agenda de su presidencia y que constituye un tema de vital importancia en los esfuerzos de este Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas en colaboración con la Unión Africana para mantener la paz y seguridad en el continente africano en particular y en general la seguridad internacional global
and in general, the global security of all member states of the United Nations.
También agradecemos al señor secretario general Antonio Guterres, a las señoras Liberata Mulla, Naledi Maite y Linda Vilakazi por sus amplias e ilustrativas exposiciones que nos ayudan a contextualizar la diplomacia preventiva, la prevención y resolución de los conflictos para mantener la paz y seguridad internacionales, valiéndose de los buenos oficios en la utilización del diálogo y la mediación como únicos medios. Señor presidente, uno de los propósitos fundamentales de las Naciones Unidas y un elemento esencial de su mandato es el mantenimiento de la paz y seguridad internacional. Desde la fundación de las Naciones Unidas hace 74 años, en muchas ocasiones esta organización mundial ha evitado que las controversias degeneren en guerras a través de la persuasión a los contrincantes a usar la mesa de conferencias y de diálogo en vez de la fuerza de las armas, y que cuando haya estallado el conflicto ayudar a establecer la paz. La manera más efectiva de mitigar el sufrimiento humano, los enormes costos económicos y las secuelas de los conflictos es evitándolos. En este sentido, las Naciones Unidas, a través de la Asamblea General, el Consejo de Seguridad, las organizaciones internacionales regionales y subregionales tienen un papel importante en la prevención de los conflictos, el uso de la diplomacia, los buenos oficios y la mediación, los enviados especiales, las misiones de políticas en el terreno, las operaciones de mantenimiento de la paz, las medidas coercitivas, el desarme preventivo y las recomendaciones de la Secretaría General de las Naciones Unidas, conforme a la Carta
such tools are provided for under the Charter of this body. In other words, we have an extensive toolkit of strategies for conflict prevention already in place.
El fortalecimiento de la cooperación internacional entre las Naciones Unidas y la Unión Africana es intrínsecamente imprescindible, ya que el desarrollo de África como continente abundante en todo tipo de recursos humanos y económicos es una condición para el equilibrio y la paz del mundo y debe ser del interés de toda la comunidad internacional en cuanto al financiamiento de los proyectos de las misiones multinacionales desplegadas
multidimensional missions deployed by the United Nations and the African Union to maintain peace and security in the region, given how crucial these missions are for stability in our African region. This brings me neatly to make the point about the need for sustainable and predictable financing and funding to support African Union-led peace operations on a case-by-case basis with a budget set and assessed by the United Nations. President,
la República de Guinea Ecuatorial es un país convencido de la importancia de la diplomacia preventiva y cree en la misma, donde ha participado esfuerzos de prevención de estallidos de conflictos en varios países de África y a través de consultas y esfuerzos de mediación, con la participación directa de su excelencia Obiangama Mbasogo, presidente de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial, quien tuvo un papel decisivo en la normalización de la situación postelectoral en la República del Gambia a principios de 2017. De ahí que nuestra delegación reitera su agradecimiento a la presidencia sudafricana por haber traído este tema a debate, ya que es muy consistente con los esfuerzos y la importancia que los miembros de A3 de este Consejo de Seguridad venimos otorgando durante estos 2 últimos años a las relaciones de cooperación entre las Naciones Unidas y la Unión Africana sobre las cuestiones de paz y seguridad. Se acordarán perfectamente que durante la presidencia de Côte d'Ivoire en diciembre del año pasado mantuvimos un debate abierto sobre la cooperación entre la ONU y las organizaciones regionales y subregionales, focalizado sobre el papel de los Estados, los arreglos regionales y la prevención y solución de conflictos por la ONU, sobre todo en África. Durante la presidencia de Guinea Ecuatorial en febrero de este año, este Consejo mantuvo un debate abierto sobre la cooperación entre las Naciones Unidas
held an open debate on cooperation between the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations, focused in particular on the initiative Silencing the Guns in Africa by 2020. We used that open debate to explore ways and means by which the United Nations and the African Union could collaborate more deeply to put an end to conflicts in Africa. That open debate in February of this year culminated in the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2457, Silencing the Guns in Africa, a resolution which urges the United Nations and the African Union to enhance their cooperation, to align their efforts for the prevention and resolution of conflicts in Africa.
Durante el próximo mes de noviembre se prevé la celebración en Malabo, República de Guinea Ecuatorial, la conferencia ministerial sobre silenciar las armas, a la que estarán invitados, entre otros países, los países miembros del Consejo de Seguridad, y que constituirá una ocasión única para abordar en profundidad el tema que estamos debatiendo hoy aquí, a saber, la centralidad de la diplomacia preventiva y la prevención y resolución de conflictos, pues silenciar las armas en África es el mecanismo adecuado para que los conflictos acaben en África. Señor Presidente, concluyo pues mi intervención resaltando que ahora es el momento adecuado y oportuno para hacer valer la importante que las mujeres pueden desempeñar en la diplomacia preventiva, la prevención y la solución de conflictos por vías pacíficas. De ahí la necesidad de que sean siempre parte de los procesos de mediación y diálogo para la prevención de conflictos. Acabo señalando que en el marco de la prevención de conflictos, Su Excelencia el Presidente de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial, Obiang Mambazo, cuando presidía la Unión Africana en el año 2011, desplegó ingentes esfuerzos para prevenir el conflicto que hoy se conoce en Libia, destacando a varios presidentes africanos para que se trasladasen a Trípoli, Libia, y hacer sacar del país al aquel entonces presidente Muammar el-Gaddafi. Desgraciadamente, muchos no estuvieron de acuerdo con esa iniciativa africana y Libia se sumergió en lo que hoy conocemos tristemente en este país hermano africano. Muchas gracias.
I thank the Representative of Equatorial Guinea for his statement. I now give the floor to the Representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the Secretary General's engagement and the briefings from our three guests. I'd like to start by reading a passage that caught my attention this past weekend. There is broad consensus that conflict prevention, management, or resolution in Africa requires that Africans themselves act as a rudder, guiding peace processes forward and working with local disputants to bring about conciliation. Outside parties, such as the U.S., can contribute by providing support to propel the search for peace forward, but peace cannot be imposed from abroad. Yet conflicts in Africa have international ramifications, evident in refugee flows and environmental damage, for example, but also in purely humanitarian terms. Broad consensus also exists that the old adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is especially applicable to conflicts in Africa. These words weren't written recently. They weren't written this year or even this decade. They are from a 1994 United States Institute of Peace report on conflict prevention in Africa. 25 years on, and we're still talking about this. Are we going to still keep having the same conversation? Are we content with this? This council meets practically every week to discuss areas of the world affected by conflict and instability, but far too often we issue statements, impose sanctions, create commissions, and establish peacekeeping missions to address conflicts after they break out. It seems to me that we've got this a little bit backwards. So if there is one message I want to communicate, it is that there is more this council can and should do to address conflict before it erupts. There are 4 actions we can take to get ahead of conflict. First, we should use resolutions and statements to target the drivers of conflict. Our resolutions need to organize specific actions directed at root causes, not merely assemble pleasant words on paper. Second, we should utilize early warning systems and the analytical tools at our disposal to inform our debates and regional visits. Doing so, we will ensure we are focused on areas where conflict could emerge, not where it already has. As fellow Kentuckian George Clooney stated last month in comments on South Sudan, if you don't care about the problems in the country, its problems will end up on your doorstep. He's absolutely right. And so third, because neighboring countries often bear the burdens of spillover from conflict, we should increase coordination with regional and sub-regional bodies. Finally, the Security Council must continue to integrate women, peace, and security in all of its work. As President Trump reminded us in his remarks to the General Assembly, nations that empower women are wealthier, safer, and more politically stable. Women's meaningful participation in peace process will translate into more sustainable peace agreements. And as Mrs. Mulla noted, if you want something done, give it to a woman. The United States is encouraged to see countries like Niger working proactively to prevent violent conflict. Using domestic resources and international assistance, Niger has made progress in preventing violent extremists from moving freely among its border with Mali. It has also deftly managed ethno-regional tensions to deny terrorist groups new pools of potential recruits inside its borders. We look forward to working closely with Niger to highlight these best practices when they join the Council in January. Additionally, this Council should focus on more countries like Burundi and Cameroon where societal divisions and weak governments threaten stability. Upcoming elections could also exacerbate political tensions and security risk. We should visit and publicly focus on potentially hot spots to proactively shine a light on areas that could descend into conflict. We have already done this to great effect in DRC. For our part, the United States is deeply committed to long-term stability and security in Africa. These are not just words to us. They are fundamental reality of our financial and political choices. Much of our bilateral engagement on the continent focuses on preventive diplomacy. In Burkina Faso, the United States is piloting a $13.5 million program to prevent conflict. Later this month, a U.S. delegation will travel to Burkina Faso to develop programming alongside the government, civil society, and other local and international partners. The United States also invests millions of dollars in development aid and each year to complement our diplomatic efforts. In dozens of African countries, we provide funding and technical assistance to cultivate accountable governance, encourage inclusive economic growth, and support local efforts to seek peaceful alternatives to conflict. We have provided similar technical assistance to AU, ECOWAS, and several member states as part of our support of the Continental Early Warning System. Mr. President, we have had the same conversation about this issue for so long because our approach to problem solving is often too reactive. That may be the case simply because the work of conflict prevention is demanding and even burdensome. I do not deny that. But it is the right work to do. It is the smart work to do. And it is the work the Council is called to do, not merely talk about it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking today's briefers for their very informative interventions. I would also like to thank the South African presidency for organizing this debate, which addresses the core element of the Security Council mission in maintaining international peace and security. Mr. President, Poland recognizes importance and centrality of preventive diplomacy in conflict prevention and resolution, especially with regard to the UN peacekeeping missions on African continent. As it has been already noted during our debate, preventive diplomacy is and has been utilized by the UN system at large. However, it has not always been regarded as a central pillar of the work of the Security Council. With that said, we believe that the complexity descending from the evolving nature of conflicts requires a wide range of activities to tackle them. These actions should address the conflicts in a comprehensive way, using all available instruments and embracing all actors on different stages, from local communities to the high political level. With regard to the processes itself, Poland believes that it is essential for the work to be framed within main three pillars. First, peace and security process with meaningful participation of women and minorities. Second, sustainable development going hand in hand with resilience building. And third, consistent respect for human rights and rule of law. Additionally, we believe it is crucial to extend the cooperation in the conflict prevention towards private sector in order to align the core business with the strategic goals of the international community. With regard to that, when thinking of practical options of resource pooling in conflict prevention, we should consider leveraging more private resources for development, possibly in the form of blended private-public financing. Ensuring a worthy economic performance as well as good macroeconomic climate significantly help to combat tensions on the social and political front and boost investment and ensure stability in the long-term perspective. Mr. President, Poland believes that all stakeholders should continue to invest in new methods of generating financial resources, as well as innovative tools of information gathering and data analysis to better define where the risks and threats to peace and security are most urgent and where the assistance of international community is needed most. Let me underline the importance of enhanced cooperation between the United Nations, African Union, and other regional and sub-regional organizations in conflict prevention and mediation, as outlined in the AU-UN framework for enhanced partnership on peace and security and in Silencing the Guns in Africa agenda. We refer to the Article 52 of the Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, as well as the African Union Constitutive Act, which highlight the importance of regional bodies in the achievement of the peaceful settlement of disputes and primacy of preventive diplomacy as a first step to conflict prevention and resolution. Mr. President, while we reflect today on conflict prevention and resolution, let me stress the importance of mediation. In this regard, I would like to refer to the words of the EU High Representative Federica Mogherini, who said recently in New York that there is a need for a new generation of mediators, especially those who understand technology and can use it for a greater good. Furthermore, we are pleased to see that the initiative of the UN Group of Friends of Mediation, thanks to Finland and Turkey, is thriving and expanding every year. In conclusion, let me emphasize once again that conflict prevention and mediation are core principles of the UN Charter and should be reflected more strongly in the work of the UN Security Council. I believe that today's debate contributes to this goal. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the President of Poland for his statement. I now give the floor to the President of Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wish to begin by condemning the attacks against MINUSMA yesterday, which resulted in the loss of life of yet another UN peacekeeper from Chad, and to express our deepest condolences to the family and the government and people of Chad. Mr. President, we thank you for convening this important meeting. Indonesia welcomes the briefing of the Secretary General, Ambassador Mulla, Ms. Mitre, and Ms. Vilakazi. Challenges to peace in many conflict situations in Africa are complex and volatile, characterized by unprecedented civilian casualties, forced displacement, and setback to peace process. For far too often, however, we are too busy reacting to conflicts rather than preventing them and addressing their root causes. This approach is not sustainable and proved to be very costly. I wish to underline 3 points. First, shifting to the culture of prevention is a necessity. The Secretary General has emphasized conflict prevention as one of his priorities from day one, and my delegation is very supportive of this. Indonesia also endorses the concept of sustaining peace, which attaches great importance to system-wide approach to conflict prevention. We must foster synergy between this Council and other entities under the UN family and harness their comparative strength to comprehensively address conflict drivers. The UN is not lacking proper tools to prevent conflict. The UNDP and the UNODC have been assisting developing countries to promote good governance. The PBF has been funding regional peace-building initiatives in Africa. Indonesia also values the role of the Secretary General good offices and regional UN offices, and encourage the Secretary General to utilize every arsenal in his preventive toolbox to avoid recurrence of conflict. Second, the UN cannot single-handedly prevent and resolve conflicts in Africa. Through the Agenda 2060, the people of Africa aspire to have a conflict-free Africa. In realizing this noble goal, the AU and sub-regional organizations have been increasingly taking charges of peace and security matters in the continent. Robust partnership between the UN and this organization is therefore quintessential. Indeed, various forms of collaboration already exist, ranging from the deployment of a UN-AU hybrid peacekeeping mission to the UN support to regional counterterrorism initiative. Third, make full use of each organization's comparative advantages. The AU and sub-regional organizations have unmatched knowledge on the conflict in the continent and familiarity with relevant stakeholders. The UN must always listen to them. These organizations also have geographical proximity to conflict, thus strong incentive to resolve them, and the ability to be the first responder. The UN should engage with them from the earliest sign of conflict to identify workable approaches. Meanwhile, the UN could provide policy advice, political backstopping, and logistical support to the AU mission. The UN may provide adequate resources to ensure the AU can meet their critical endeavors, including the case of financing of AU-led peace operations. Additionally, the UN and regional organization could also team up in mediation efforts. Strategic discussion is needed on how the UN could better support the development of regional mediation capacity in Africa. Mr. President, ASEAN countries have been working tirelessly to promote the ASEAN way, with its fundamental reliance on preventive diplomacy to keep peace in our region. Indonesia believes Southeast Asia and Africa have much to learn from each other in preventing and resolving conflicts. I should like to close by underlining that even when regional organizations are fully determined to play their role, there is a limit in what they can do if the Security Council, is not united and not ready to take up its primary responsibility under the UN Charter, that is to maintain international peace and security. We should ensure that resources are available for peacekeeping and peace building. Expecting our special political mission as well as our peacekeepers, which, as the Secretary General mentioned, mostly in the African continent, to be able to do their noble duty with limited support is expecting a mission impossible. As the largest TCC/PCC country in the Council, I should like to pay tribute to the brave blue helmets in the fields, including those from Africa, which is the largest troop contributors in the region. Mr. President, as the last speaker in the Council before you, and having heard the statement of various colleagues in the room, I think it's quite clear for all of us that we all supported conflict prevention. Then what is needed now is to implement preventive diplomacy faithfully with wisdom and vigor. I also second the statement of the US ambassadors for us all to take action. Africa is awaiting us all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Representative of Indonesia for his statement. I now wish to address the Council in my capacity as a President of South Africa. First, colleagues, I would like to join those colleagues who have condemned the attack of our peacekeepers yesterday in Chad. I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his statement. I also extend my gratitude to Ambassador Liberata Mulla, visiting scholar, Associate Director, Institute for African Studies, Elo School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Ms. Naledi Maite, Program Manager, Sawit, and Melinda Vilakazi, Coordinator, African Women in Dialogue, South Africa, for the insightful and extensive briefing to the Council this morning. Excellencies, this debate, the first of the second week of South Africa's presidency of the Council, is symbolic as it places our emphasis on the centrality of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention, and resolution in the African continent. It is in this context that we continue our diplomatic efforts to seek solutions to the challenges in Sudan, South Sudan, South African Republic, and other conflicts around the world. We believe so because conflict prevention and resolution is less costly than peacekeeping, both in material terms, the loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and displacement of people. In his essay entitled Clear the Obstacles and Confront the Enemy, written in Robben Island Prison, 1976, Nelson Mandela reminded us why negotiations is preferable when he said the following, and I quote, When we have fought it out and reduced this country to ashes, it will be necessary for us to sit down together and talk about the problem of reconstruction. The black man and the white man, the African and Afrikaner, close quote. Excellencies, we pay tribute to the Secretary General's reform agenda, especially the peace and security pillar, which prioritizes preventive diplomacy, mediation, development of nationally owned peace agreements, and the early implementation. SABC believes that cooperation and coordination among United Nations and regional sub-regional organizations could play an important role in conflict prevention. In this regard, SABC calls for enhanced and continuous strategic and operational coordination of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention, and resolution efforts by the AU, UN, the REC, and other international and local partners. Excellency, South Africa pays tribute to the UN-AU mediation efforts in South African Republic, in South Sudan and elsewhere in the continent. The recent operationalization of the AU Peace Fund will further boost the AU's capacities and efforts in mediation and conflict prevention in our continent. The Peace Fund is structured around three thematic windows, which are mediation and preventive diplomacy, institutional capacity, and peace support operation. In this regard, the member states should be commended for their efforts in contributing to the Peace Fund, whose endowment currently stands at US $115 million. African leaders have demonstrated their political will to deal with and resolve conflicts in our continent. Excellency, the role of women and the youth in conflict prevention and mediation cannot be emphasized enough. It is common knowledge that where women are involved in peace processes, such processes are more legitimate, sustainable, and effective. We welcome the role already being played by SAWIT, AWIT, FEMWISE, and many other similar initiatives anchoring conflict prevention and resolution through holding grassroots level negotiations. We ask the General to deploy more women mediators, peace envoys, SRSGs to assist in conflict resolution and mediation across our continent. South Africa has tabled a resolution on women, peace and security agenda to ensure implementation of our previous decision regarding the role of women in peace and security. As we approach the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, we urge member states to renew their commitment to the principles and objectives of the Charter as far as resolution of dispute are concerned. Time has come for the UN and the Council to put more efforts and resources in response to Chapter 6 of the UN Charter on Pacific settlements of dispute. Excellency, South Africa is convinced that peace and stability in the world will remain elusive if we do not address the nexus between security and development. The 2030 Agenda for Development gives recognition to this vital link. In this context, consideration of the interdependence of security and development requires the different principles organ of the UN to work together in a complementary manner within their respective charter mandates to ensure a holistic and integrated approach to sustainable development and durable peace. Excellency, I wish to conclude with yet another quote from Nelson Mandela. And he says, "We were expected to destroy one another and ourselves collectively in the worst racial conflagration in South Africa. Instead, we as the people chose the path of negotiation, compromise, and peaceful settlement. Instead of hatred and revenge, we chose reconciliation and nation building." Close quote. South Africa appeals to our own brothers and sisters in our continent of Africa to adopt a similar mindset. Instead of hatred and revenge, choose reconciliation and nation building. And once more, colleagues, we urge Security Council to allocate more resources to preventive diplomacy. I thank you. I shall resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Namibia. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, since I'm taking the floor for the first time this month, I join colleagues in congratulating you for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of October. I further wish to express our appreciation to you for convening this very important meeting on the centrality of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention and resolution in Africa. I further would like to thank the Secretary General and our briefers for their comprehensive, insightful and detailed briefings on the issue at hand. Mr. President, upon its establishment in 1945, the Security Council was charged with ensuring international peace and security. Since then, Council members have authorized numerous peacekeeping missions, including in Timor-Leste, Lebanon, Haiti, Cyprus, and my own country, Namibia. The Namibian experience is proof that these missions are designed to help countries navigate the difficult path from conflict to peace. Next year, we will celebrate 30 years of this treasured peace in Namibia, and we thank the United Nations for its role in bringing that peace to my country. The implementation of Council resolutions is also key to solving conflicts. I take this opportunity to remind that unresolved issues require full support of the Security Council to ensure full implementation of these Council resolutions. Since the creation of the Security Council, the nature of conflicts have changed. Therefore, the role of the Council must also adapt. The Council must at all times guard against not being simply reactive. It must be proactive. It must play a stronger role in preventing wars and conflicts from occurring. Misery, human suffering, starvation, intolerable living conditions, human rights abuses are amongst the early warning signals that we must all look out for. Succeeding in this requires strong cooperation with regional and sub-regional organizations who are more familiar and in tune with situations in their respective regions. Mr. President, I want to add also that we must focus on external factors as well, such as climate change and food insecurity. These are early warning signals of problems to come as far as peace and security is concerned. President, the signing in April 2017 of the joint United Nations African Union framework for an enhanced partnership in peace and security provides guidance for deepening cooperation between the two organizations at all levels in peace and security. Since then, this vital partnership has gone from strength to strength. In this regard, Namibia firmly supports the call by the African Union and the African members of the Security Council for predictable financing for AU-led peace support operations authorized by the Security Council through UN-assessed contributions. The strengthening of the UN-AU partnership has been concretely demonstrated in recent months with the signing of peace agreements in the Central African Republic and South Sudan notably. Sudan is also an excellent example of the power of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention and resolution. The upcoming Security Council visit to the African Union headquarters, where consultations will be held with the AU Peace and Security Council, also demonstrates the importance of the UN-AU partnership. Mr. President, during Namibia's chairmanship of SADC from August 2018 to August 2019, the need to prioritize preventive diplomacy and mediation in approaching crises and conflict situations was continuously emphasized. Concrete examples of this policy were the successful and peaceful elections held in both the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Madagascar. SADC has been assisting in finding a political solution in Lesotho, and we are optimistic that through dialogue, that sisterly country is moving in the right direction. SADC is in full support of the need to enhance the AU's prevention capabilities and tools in the context of the AU's aspiration of silencing the guns by 2020. We cannot overemphasize preventative diplomacy, mediation and negotiations in peace building and reconstruction. Mr. President, I also wish to emphasize the importance of women negotiators and mediators in peace building processes as espoused in the AU Agenda 2063. It was in 2000, during Namibia's presidency of the UN Security Council, that the Council unanimously adopted a landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. This resolution formally drew global attention to the unrecognized, underutilized, and undervalued contributions of women in preventative war, peace building, and engaging individuals and societies to live in harmony. According to the International Peace Institute, when women participate in peace process, the resulting agreement is 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. This number alone should encourage parties to ensure that women must be part of the conversation. We as an international community can only benefit by recognizing the fundamental role of women in peace and security. Towards this end, Namibia will be launching an International Women's Peace Center, and we welcome commitments by other member states on concrete deliverables in the coming years, such as Commitment 25 on women's inclusion in peace processes by Finland and Spain. Mr. President, to conclude, I would like to underscore Namibia's commitment to preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention, and resolution. My delegation further recognizes the ongoing peace efforts on the continent, and we commend the efforts of the UN and the AU, as well as sub-regional organizations and regional economic commissions. We firmly believe that taking a more proactive approach by using preventive diplomacy and conflict prevention will bring an end to violence on the African continent. As our founding father in Namibia once said, and I quote, "A people united, striving to achieve a common good for all members of society will always emerge victorious." End of quote. In making this wisdom relevant, I believe the Council would see much more success. I thank you.
I thank the Representative of Namibia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Representative of Ethiopia.
Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to congratulate South Africa for assuming the presidency of the UN Security Council for the month of October. Our delegation wishes to assure you of its fullest support and cooperation during your tenure. Let me once again thank you, Mr. President, for organizing this critically important debate. We hope it will rekindle our aspiration for a strong cooperation between the UN Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council, especially in building capacity for preventive diplomacy. We thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Ambassador Mulla, and the civil society representative, Ms. Linda and Ms. Nalindi, for their comprehensive briefing and reflections. Mr. President, Ethiopia strongly believes that conflict prevention and mediation are critical tools for sustaining peace and development. Preventing the outbreak of conflict and their recurrence are also the central pillars of the African Union peace and security architecture. We trust the fundamentals in the cooperation between the United Nations and the African Union also lies on the need to promote conflict prevention and the primacy of political solution, which centers on properly implementing the objective of the peace architecture, such as the African Continental Early Warning System, the targeted activities of the AU Mediation Support Unit, and the work of the AU Panel of the Wise. At this juncture, I wish to recall that discussions in this Council on the importance of strengthening AU peace and security architecture, including the need for sustainable
and predictable funding for AU peace support operation through such mechanisms, the UN assessed contribution is not showing satisfactory progress. Mr. President, on balance, the use of preventive diplomacy by the United Nations system, particularly the Secretary General's good offices, remains indispensable but underutilized in avoiding and containing crisis situations. The Security Council must also do more to support and promote national and regional conflict prevention efforts. This is highly important since the nature of modern conflicts tend to be transnational, especially where borders are porous, as it is the case in many parts of Africa. It therefore goes without saying that both the humanitarian and material losses resulting from conflicts are too great. That's why they should be stopped or minimized through conflict prevention, mediation, and preventive diplomacy, which are by far the best tools we have to avert the outbreak of crisis. Mr. President, we have recently witnessed the significance of mediation in our region. The collective wisdom of the Sudanese people, the endeavors of the African Union, Ethiopia, and IGAD has resulted in facilitating peace and stability in the Sudan, and did bless the peacemakers. What we witnessed, again, is conflict prevention, as you said, Mr. President, and the resolution are less costly. It brings hopes, nurture cooperation, give us the moment and the serenity to reflect how wars are destructive and peace build life and hope. Mr. President, we believe that inclusivity and building national consensus is a foundation for successful conflict prevention in intrastate disputes. Peace endures when development is inclusive, when citizens' security is guaranteed, when women and young people are actively involved in decision makings, and when barriers to their economic advancements are removed. We have seen the power and potential of young people as agents of positive change all across our region, most recently in Ethiopia and Sudan, as well as across West African countries. We must listen to young people, their hopes, aspirations, and worries. The meaningful participation of youth in peace-building activities will deny armed and terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab the chances to thrive by exploiting development and governance gaps. In some of the conflict zones in the African continent, the total absence of state structure and functioning institutions, as well as corruption and maladministration, have pushed a sizable number of young people to consider joining these terrorist groups. It is therefore critical to continue to invest in youth empowerment, bolster state capacity, and good governance initiative at the local level, including in ungoverned spaces. Mr. President, Ethiopia is committed to the implementation of the African Union's peace and security architecture, as well as its flagship vision of silencing the gun by 2020, both of which emphasize conflict prevention and the pacific settlement of disputes on the continent. In our sub-region, Europe has championed the goals of IGAD conflict early warning and response mechanism, which aims to prevent violent conflicts through structured and consistent early warning and early response. At the national level, over the past year and a half, Ethiopia has prioritized building peace, including by setting up a cabinet-level ministry to ensure the implementation of peace-building measures to strengthen the rule of law and bolster the capacity of our security sectors. In addition to empowering local communities, we are anchoring our peace-building initiative on indigenous traditions, such as the use of elders, councils, and religious leaders with the objective of reaching a national consensus. We recognize that these efforts will not succeed without the active participation of women and youth. Once again, we would like to reiterate that despite significant progress in recent years, these regional and national conflict prevention objectives cannot be met by Africans alone, not least because of lack of material and financial resources. the international community, particularly the Security Council, whose primary function is the maintenance of international peace and security, should actively support national, sub-regional, and regional efforts with the view that prevention is better than cure. In this regard, we urge members of the Security Council to further strengthen UN-AU partnership around peace and security as a platform for conflict prevention and mediation in the continent. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the President of Ethiopia for his statement, and now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Jean Biage, Permanent Observer, Economic Community for Central Africa States to the United Nations. You have the floor, madam.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me thank you, Mr. President, for convening this debate on peace and security in Africa with a focus on the centrality of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention, and resolution of conflict. We thank you also for providing this platform and opportunity to review efforts put in place in this particular field with a view to enhance collaboration and build more ties with while opening up opportunities for closer operational cooperation. ECAS highly appreciates contributions shared during this debate. Mr. President, maintaining global peace and security requires collaboration between several actors. In this respect, ECAS acknowledges milestones achieved in addressing issues impeding peace and security, putting forward prevention and preventive diplomacy and good offices through our strategic partnership with the UN and AU, and thanks to the assistance of our bilateral and multilateral partners, civil society network of women and youth. In this respect, my contribution to this debate will focus on three major points. First, I'll give you a brief historical background of the involvement of ECAS in peace and security issues. Then I will highlight areas of cooperation with other entities, and we conclude with remaining gaps and challenges calling for concerted actions to speed up implementation of initiatives taken in preventing conflicts. Before delving into today's theme, allow me therefore to revisit briefly the security situation in Central Africa, a region prone to all sorts of conflicts due to its geographic location, at the heart of a volatile geopolitical landscape regularly marked by recurrent conflicts adversely compromising peace and security with a negative bearing on the sub-region community. It's worth mentioning that this alarming state of affairs has been in the making not today nor yesterday, but mainly between 1992 and 1998. During that period, 7 of our 11 member states went through violent wars and a devastating genocide, prompting the institution to embrace a new orientation in its objectives. ECAS that focused initially on the promotion and enhancement of a harmonious cooperation and a balanced and self-sustained economic and social development in all fields with the ultimate goal of realizing regional integration, was then compelled to reinforce its objectives in February 1999 with the creation of the Council of Peace and Security, COPAX, whose core mission was to prevent and resolve conflicts in the sub-region. Since its inception, it has focused its action in the field of conflict prevention, early warning mechanism, and more recently in strengthening cooperation with organizations of civil society active in the field of conflict prevention. Political and diplomatic actions have also been conducted to counter control of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. In this framework, the heads of state and government have vowed to enhance the promotion of peace and security at the highest level as a prerequisite to improve citizens' living conditions, security, and stability in the region. However, preventing conflicts of different nature erupting in the region, leading to social crisis and curbing system problems stemming from poverty and all sorts of exclusions, as well as governance issues at the root of political and institutional conflicts, have proved to be a tedious exercise. Tensions tend to escalate during electoral processes, while terrorism and violent extremism attacks and their corollary of forced migrations, transnational crimes and maritime security are on the rise, eating away all resources devoted to development. Worth mentioning are also cross-cutting issues linked with human trafficking, smuggling, illicit cross-border trade, as well as arms proliferation. We note with concern long-standing traditions such as transhumance and pastoralism that have now become source of conflicts, triggering instability and resurgence of negative forces and armed groups looting natural resources. Battling those challenges in a holistic and inclusive manner has been promoted by all parties involved. In this respect, ECAS lauds the meaningful involvement in preventive efforts of women and youth networks that have proven to be a strong asset to rely on in order to achieve lasting peace. ECAS will therefore continue to work in tandem with the AU and the UN through the Office of the United Nations in Central Africa, UNOCA, in building capacity to empower those agents of change, namely women and youth, so as to ensure their equal participation in all efforts deployed to promote peace and security, and in enabling them to play a central role in leadership and decision-making. Collaboration between all those actors is also needed to curb and eradicate proliferation of small arms and light weapons if we are to silence the guns by 2020 and create ideal conditions for development to thrive and achieve sustainable development goals. It is urgent to realize that those changing realities of conflicts coming in sophisticated and multifaceted dimensions in the field of conflict prevention call for a drastic shift in our response. This is at the root of the new and innovative approach prompting the AU and its main pillars, namely the RECs, the Regional Economic Community, and member states to try to embrace other avenues and endogenous solutions to peace and security issues. To achieve that noble goal, Africa is leaning towards financing a major part of its own operations of maintaining peace while expecting assistance from this august body that holds the responsibility of maintaining peace and security in the world. Pooling predictable resources to find adequate solutions to the challenges remain relevant in complementing efforts to be deployed. Mr. President, distinguished members of this august assembly, within the framework of subsidiarity, complementarity, and solidarity, the AU, UN, and ECAS and other regional entities work together to coordinate and harmonize their interventions in prevention and in addressing the root causes to conflicts. Allow me to illustrate some areas of collaboration and joint actions conducted under regional arrangements with few examples that have yielded tangible results. Progress has indeed been achieved through several mediation, good offices, and political missions that have eased hostilities and lately resolved political crises. Some latest positive development due to the role played by regional organizations include the collaboration of ECAS, ICGLR, and neighboring states in supporting the AU initiative for peace and reconciliation in the Central African Republic. The panel of facilitators comprised of ECAS member states and actors from neighboring countries, as well as MINUSCA and the EU engagement in that process were instrumental in the implementation of the African Initiative Roadmap in easing tensions with armed groups that led to the Bangui Peace and Reconciliation Agreement. In DRC, we witnessed a peaceful transition of power for the first time that has led to positive changes. The just concluded national dialogue in Cameroon has sparked new hope in the resolution of differences affecting communities. At this juncture, it is important to mention that ECAS is about to conclude an institutional reform that will boost capacity of its organ of early warning mechanism, MARAC, as well as its multinational force, FOMAC, with a view to align them with the continental architecture. Currently, those two bodies are quite challenged and their level of intervention minimized despite their comparative advantage to the proximity of the scene of action. Among their stumbling blocks lie the decision-making process as well as the lack of human, logistical, and financial resources. There is therefore a great need to build their capacity to enable them to mount fast interventions in an emergency situation, often hampered by the tedious nature of decision-making, as it requires the green light from the Conference of Heads of States and Government to be put in motion. To alleviate these challenges, ECAS urges our economic and financial partners to enhance MARAC, early warning system, and FOMAC capacities at the image of the AU Peace and Security Council or the UN Security Council. To contribute to those initiatives, ECAS will continue to push for COPAC's regular meetings during the Head of States and Government Summit, while ensuring to report its work on a daily basis to inform the decision of Head of States and trigger action if needed. In conclusion, ECAS salutes the UN for recognizing the complementarity role played by regional and sub-regional organizations, mainly in the Pacific settlements of disputes. The AU reform gives an even more important role to the REX, and the ECAS reform has taken into account all those changes and the contribution and new responsibility assigned to regional economic communities. ECAS values the AU technical support to our organ of early warning system that will boost it in reaching its operationalization to the level of other regional organs and enable it to deliver on its mandate. Finally, let me, in closing, reiterate ECA's strong commitment to the importance of investing in prevention of conflicts and to relying on preventive diplomacy instead of using force in mediation efforts as an invaluable, viable path to conflict resolution. I thank you.
I thank Excellency Ms. Jean Biache for her statement. I now give the floor to Excellency Ms. Fatima Mohammed, an observer of the African Union to the United Nations. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me start by congratulating you on taking over the presidency of the Security Council for the month of October, and to thank you and the Republic of South Africa for including this important item relating to peace and security in Africa with a focus on the centrality of preventive diplomacy and conflict prevention on the agenda of the Security Council. I would also like to thank the Secretary General and the briefers for their enlightening briefing, and particularly on highlighting the role of women in preventive diplomacy and how we can leverage off the platforms and initiatives to promote better engagement. Mr. President, the contemporary threats to peace and security in our continent, and indeed globally, are so complex and interconnected with broad consequences that no single organization alone can manage to provide the appropriate solutions. Consequently, the scale and complexity of the challenges we face today require the harnessing of the collective efforts of all our stakeholders. In this context, the centrality of preventive diplomacy as a peacemaking tool becomes indispensable in our peace efforts. Today's debate is therefore all the more relevant because preventive diplomacy and conflict prevention remain a strategic priority for all of us. They perfectly illustrate the raison d'être of multilateralism and the different organizations that emanate from it. And at a time when the credibility of our organization is being questioned, this debate could serve as a basis to harness our collective commitment to devote greater attention to the prevention tool, which remains by far the most profitable in the long term, but unfortunately the least resourced. With this in mind, permit me to make the following 3 key points. First, given its clear comparative advantage in this area, the African Union has over the last decades adopted several instruments, mechanisms, and policy documents to boost its prevention capacities. As a result, Africa is well equipped within the African peace and security architecture and the African governance architecture as its twin blueprint for promoting peace, security, and stability. The APSA is built upon a continuum ranging from anticipation and prevention of conflict management and resolution of conflicts to post-conflict stabilization, reconstruction, and development. As you are aware, the AU Peace and Security Council is the nerve center of the African peace and security architecture. Since it became operational in 2004, the AU Peace and Security Council has covered significant ground and made considerable gains in addressing and resolving conflicts on the continent. Another pillar of the APSA is the Panel of the Wise, which is the core of the African Union preventive diplomacy. The Panel of the Wise, since its operationalization in 2007, has significantly contributed towards enhancing preventive diplomacy in Africa. Stemming from this panel, there are a number of arrangements in supporting subsidiary platforms, including PanWise, which is a platform of the African Union and regional economic communities and regional mechanisms panels involved in preventive diplomacy. Within the framework of enhancing preventive diplomacy, I would like to point out that the African Union Commission now has a functioning mediation support unit to institutionalize and provide predictable and sustainable support to all AU-led mediation efforts. Furthermore, the African Union's peacemaking and preventive diplomacy efforts are also championed by special envoys, special representatives, high representatives, as well as 13 liaison offices and missions across the continent. While some progress has been made in close collaboration with the sub-regional organizations and with the strong support of the United Nations, we must recognize that a number of the challenges continue to undermine our ability to effectively deliver on our mandate, most notably the possibility of gaining appropriate entry points into tense situations likely to evolve into violent conflicts. The second point I'd like to make, Mr. President, is on the importance of strategic partnerships. Indeed, the collaboration between the African Union and its regional economic communities and mechanisms, and with the UN, as provided in the various frameworks, is addressing and resolving conflicts and has progressively gained momentum as guided by the provisions in the African Union Peace and Security Architecture and the African Governance Architecture. The joint UN-AU Framework for Enhanced Partnership in Peace and Security, signed in April 2017, is premised on the growing recognition that stronger partnership between the African Union and the UN is a strategic necessity in the process of responding early, coherently, and decisively to prevent and manage conflicts in Africa. In addition, the progressively deepening partnership between the Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council through the annual consultative meetings is a testament to the tremendous progress that has been made in fostering our collective efforts to address the complex peace and security challenges in Africa. Close consultations between the two councils and the implementation of the joint UN-AU Framework for Enhanced Partnership in Peace and Security is improving our shared appreciation of the challenges we are confronted with, and is sharpening our response tools, including through preventive diplomacy. Mr. President, I would also like to highlight that the AU Agenda 2063 envisions a peaceful, prosperous, and integrated Africa, which is consistent with the UN Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development Goals. In line with the spirit of Agenda 2063, the AU is implementing its flagship project on silencing the guns on the continent. In this respect, I wish to commend the Council for its contribution to this effort by adopting Resolution 2457 earlier this year, in which, amongst others, it calls for the mobilization of the United Nations and its agencies to support the African Union in the implementation of its noble goal for silencing the guns in Africa by 2020. The results thus far obtained from this collaboration are quite appreciable, and you will agree with me, Mr. President, that only by pooling our collective expertise and resources together and leveraging our comparative advantages and working collaboratively can our two organizations realistically expect to have a positive impact on the ground. My third and last point is on the important role of including women and youth in peace processes, which cannot be overemphasized. It is only by ensuring that they are part of not only the decision-making roles in conflict resolution, but also in mediation, including in the implementation of peace agreements, can we truly address the issues vital to securing sustainable peace. The AU Commission, on its part, has created platforms for the empowerment of women in peace and security, such as FEMWISE, which is a network of women mediators. This network has attracted many young women mediators, a good number of whom have been trained and are being deployed to some conflict and post-conflict areas to accompany the political processes in several countries. In addition, our efforts to enhance women's participation and leadership through the African Union and the United Nations, we came together to help launch the African Women's Movement called the African Women Leaders Network, AWLIN, in June 2017. The African Union has also recently launched the Initiative of Youth for Peace, which aims at empowering youth and engaging them in peace processes in the continent. In this regard, the chairperson of the African Union Commission has appointed a special envoy for youth, a young lady with the necessary experience and commitment, who addressed the Council recently. We're also undertaking regional consultations with African youth in order to further enlist their efforts towards building peace on the continent. Mr. President, in our endeavors, we're always conscious of the primary responsibility of our member states to prevent and resolve conflicts, as well as to protect civilians and promote human rights as provided for in the relevant African instruments and international law. This being so, I would like to highlight to this meeting the launch of the Grand National Dialogue in Cameroon, dedicated to finding an internal national solution to the crisis affecting some parts of the country. We welcome this initiative because we are convinced that local initiatives driven by people stand a better chance of reaching a lasting solution in a spirit of compromise for the preservation of peace, stability, harmony, and national unity. In this vein, our collective peacemaking endeavors in Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, the Central African Republic, Somalia, Mali and the Sahel, and the Great Lakes region, and including the Lake Chad Basin and the Horn of Africa, are commendable and should be consolidated through enhanced partnership between the African Union, the regional economic communities, and the UN. In conclusion, indeed, mediation as part of preventive diplomacy is indispensable in the resolution of crises and conflicts. Improving shared analysis and appreciation of the challenges we are confronted with is an important first step to providing coherent, effective, and timely responses to conflict and crisis situations in Africa. In this context, we need to utilize all preventive diplomacy tools, amongst which are good offices, special representatives and envoys, and emissaries to foster a collective approach. Despite gains made, more needs to be done to further enhance the effectiveness of preventive diplomacy. I would like to therefore stress the importance of continued collective and concerted efforts to respond to the existing and emerging threats. The relevance of partnerships and the collaboration between governments, civil society organizations, and the private sector, as well as the sustained engagement of all stakeholders, including women and youth, in the decision-making processes relating to the promotion of peace and advancement of socioeconomic development. Only by pooling our collective efforts and expertise and resources together, weighing our comparative advantages and working collaboratively, can we realistically expect to have a positive impact and durable solutions to ensure sustainable peace. I thank you.
I thank Excellency Ambassador Mohammed for her statement and ending just on time. Dear colleagues, there are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. So, the meeting is adjourned.
Right.